got loyalty, got royalty inside my DNA. I got killer beats, got war and peace inside my DNA. I got poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA.
Hello and welcome back to my channel, FIC Fantasy. Today, we're kicking off the second part of our series, What If Zenitsu Was Demon? The author of this story is Chocosaurus from AO3. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. Hold up. Zenitsu called out frantically to the two running in front of him. Could you guys please wait? Both Zenitsu's companions ceased their movement and turned back to Zenitsu, surprise noticeable in both of their sounds. While Inosuke showed no visible emotion with his mask being currently on, apprehension immediately crossed Tanjiro's face. Zenitsu felt his stomach drop knowing that he was making Tanjiro worry about him again. What's wrong, Zenitsu? Tanjiro asked, his voice filled with pure concern over his well-being. It sickened Zenitsu that Tanjiro was more worried about him than the dark looming forest in front of them. He really wished the three of them could have stayed longer at the old monster lady's house. Being able to relax and not worry about fighting demons was nice and comforting. Sure, Zenitsu had to hide his condition from the old lady, but she still treated him kindly. In fact, she never bothered him to take off his mask. She let the trio stay for weeks, providing them meals and lodging, never expecting anything in return. How could Zenitsu want to leave such a place in which he was safe and well tended to? But they did, and it was all thanks to Tanjiro's annoying crow. A day after Tanjiro and Inosuke had been checked and officially cleared by the doctor, the crow had decided to give them their next order. They were all to head to a place called Nadagumo Mountain. While Zenitsu had never heard of the mountain before, he knew that it was certainly another demon's nest. That was all the crow ever sent them to. And the crow ordered them to head to the mountain without any further delay. It was a wonder how he was able to follow Tanjiro and Inosuke without breaking down in fear after the old monster lady had bid them goodbye with a ritual for good luck for their next dangerous mission. Well, almost. Here he was now sitting on the ground, trembling at the creepy vibe he was getting from the mountain in front of them. How could Tanjiro and Inosuke not see that the mountain was a place they shouldn't dare enter? Even Chuntaro, the sparrow given to him by Tamayo, was admonishing him for his fear by pecking the back of his neck from inside the scarf it had buried herself into, the place it had come to like to stay on beside the top of his head. He disliked how the not-so-loyal sparrow was adamant on making him follow Tanjiro and Inosuke to complete their mission. He could hear too many ominous sounds coming from inside it. The mountain was crawling with something so foul and evil. Why the hell is he sitting? Inosuke grumbled in irritation from inside his boar mask as he looked over to Zenitsu. You're pissing me off. I don't want to hear that from you, pighead. Zenitsu snapped, ignoring another peck from Chuntaro and raising his shaky index finger at the other. If anything, I should be the one set off. It's clear that I'm the only normal one here who can tell that mountain is scary. We shouldn't go inside it. Both boys silently stared back at Zenitsu and turned to the looming mountain in the distance. Zenitsu could have sworn that the clouds above the mountain were abnormally darker now. It was a sure obvious sign of the danger looming inside the mountain. The longer Zenitsu gazed at the foreboding clouds, the more his body began to tremble. Why couldn't the three of them just turn away from this mission? Zenitsu, Tanjiro said gently as he turned back to his trembling friend. I know you're scared, but we can't sit here. There might be others inside that need our help. We can't leave them alone. Zenitsu clamped his mouth shut, eyes slowly moving solemnly down at the ground in pure shame. Tanjiro was not like his grandfather when it came to scolding. While his grandfather would scold him by whacking him with his cane until he was sure the lesson was drilled into Zenitsu's head, Tanjiro would simply scold him with just his words. And Tanjiro was patient and gentle with his scolding, always making sure his words never emotionally hurt the other. Sure, Tanjiro never spoke harshly to hurt Zenitsu, but it still hurt to be scolded by him. The last thing Zenitsu wanted to do was let down the red-headed boy. If only he could be as strong as Tanjiro and Inosuke. As Zenitsu felt the longing to cry again over his lack of courage, a sound of pain suddenly reached Zenitsu's ears. He whipped his head up in time to see Tanjiro already bolting to the mountain with Inosuke not too far behind. Not wanting to be left behind, Zenitsu reluctantly got up and followed, ignoring the loud chirps of Chuntaro from behind his neck. He was sure the sparrow was telling him to pick up his pace. Zenitsu came to a stop behind Tanjiro, quickly hiding behind him as he gazed down at what was slowly crawling out of the mountain. It was a black-haired boy. The boy wore a black uniform, an indication that he was a demon slayer, but he was heavily wounded. Once the struggling boy noticed the trio, he shakily called out to them, blood splattering to the ground from his mouth as he spoke. "Help! Me!" The boy helplessly begged, tears running down his cheeks as he tried to reach slowly forward to the trio with his hand. "Save me! Are you alright?" Tanjiro called out, not wasting a second to run forward to the wounded boy. What happened? However, before Tanjiro's hand could reach out to the other, the wounded boy was suddenly yanked back to the mountain by an unseen force. The boy disappeared beyond the trees as his desperate screams for help trailed off in the distance. The only thing that remained was the eerily silence. Zenitsu stared wide-eyed at the entrance, his body too shocked to make any movement besides gape in pure horror. The heavily wounded boy had been pulled back by something after nearly making it out of the mountain. If the three entered the mountain, would the same happen to them? If they tried to escape, would they be pulled back into the mountain's clutches, never to see another light of day? "I'm going." Zenitsu blinked in shock at the calmness of Tanjiro's bold statement, turning to the red-haired boy in disbelief. Inosuke wasted no time to react to Tanjiro's remark and took a step forward, slightly shoving Tanjiro to the side with his shoulder. He placed his hands over his blades, turning to the other with excitement that buzzed from his chaotic sound. Couldn't the guy at least show some fear at what was inside? "I shall be the vanguard." Inosuke guffawed, his voice filled with pride. "You can just bring your trembling buttocks and follow me. I'm hungry to fight another demon." "Why, you can't be serious." Zenitsu muttered, his voice cracking up from the overwhelming fear. Tanjiro turned back to him and landed his calming red eyes at Zenitsu's trembling form, a frown slowly finding its way to his face. Gently, he called out to the frightened yellow-haired boy. "Zenitsu, let's go inside together." I can't, Tanjiro," Zenitsu answered, ignoring the way Inosuke's sound grew louder with irritability at his reluctance to barge into the mountain as well. "I'm not strong like you and Inosuke. A demon won't waste its breath on me, but I know I will make a mistake and it will cost both of you your lives. You'll both get eaten because of my weakness. I can't do that to either of you." Tanjiro tilted his head in confusion, but smiled, his lips faintly curling up in gratitude. He walked forward and took Zenitsu's hand into his, catching the yellow-haired boy off guard. "Zenitsu," Tanjiro said, his voice steady, but gentle. "Please don't say that. You are strong. I'm grateful that you don't want me and Inosuke to get hurt, but I don't want you to stay here alone." Tanjiro's hold gripped tighter as he spoke once more. "There's nothing to be afraid of. Zenitsu, you have to trust me that anything you do will never hurt me or Inosuke. Let's be brave together, okay?" Zenitsu wanted to deny Tanjiro's words. He truly wanted to, but the truth was he couldn't. He couldn't refute anything. Even though he could feel the anxiety and fear bubbling up in his chest, he knew he couldn't let these things stop him. Not when Tanjiro was waiting for him to enter the mountain together with him and Inosuke. How could he let Tanjiro down when the red-haired boy had consoled him and offered him his support? It wouldn't be right to let Tanjiro go by himself now, especially with someone as barbaric as Inosuke. That was why Zenitsu decided to take Tanjiro's hand and allowed the other to lead him to the mountain's entrance. The three ran through the dark forest, crossing over shrubs and logs that littered the ground on their path. All too quickly, their path also began to become littered with spiderwebs, too many for Zenitsu to want to continue to ignore. There was no doubt in Zenitsu's mind that the spiderwebs were connected to a demon. He felt his hand grip tighter onto Tanjiro's Haori at this thought when he heard a rustle from a bush to his left. He froze and turned along with Tanjiro and Inosuke to find a dark-haired boy with his back towards them wearing the Demon Slayer uniform. Zenitsu almost let out a sigh of relief at the sight of the boy, but one quick look at the boy's trembling form made him pause in thought. The higher-ups from the Demon Slayer Corps wouldn't have sent this boy by himself, would they? Tanjiro was the first to walk forward to the dark-haired boy, giving him a gentle tap to his cheek. The dark-haired boy immediately went rigid in response and whirled around to face the trio, his hand already gripping the hilt of his sword ready to defend himself. However, once he realized that it was, in fact, a human and not a demon in front of him, the boy slowly relaxed, but Zenitsu could tell that the boy was still on edge. "I'm Kamado Tanjiro." Tanjiro politely greeted, as he gestured to both Inosuke and Zenitsu. "And this is Hashibara Inosuke and Agatsuma Zenitsu. We're all rank 10 and here for support." "Our rank 10? The boy sputtered, his face quickly going deathly pale at those words. He clenched his teeth, his shoulders shaking in terror. Why didn't they send a pillar? The result will be the same, no matter how many level 10s come. It's pointless for you three to be here. A clenched fist suddenly flew to the boy's nose, slamming it to his face with a deafening snap. Zenitsu flinched from the abrupt sound, taking a step back in fright as Tanjiro sprung forward to elevate the situation, but Inosuke completely ignored any attempt Tanjiro made to pull him away from the black-haired boy. Inosuke roughly grabbed a fistful of the dark-haired boy's hair and pulled him harshly forward to his mask, his unmoving eyes staring back at the poor bloody-nosed boy. So annoying. Inosuke grumbled with irritation from underneath his mask. He shook the boy in his grasp, pointing at him with his finger. If you keep insisting that things are pointless, then your very existence is pointless. We're here, so just accept that, you coward. Now make yourself useful and explain the situation. Knowing that if he didn't speak, Inosuke would give him another punch to his face, the trembling black-haired quickly explained the situation. He and a group of 10 other demon slayers had received a command from their crows to enter the mountain. However, not long after entering the mountain, the group of demon slayers turned on each other and began to kill each other with their swords. They all struggled initially, trying to not draw their swords on each other, but their efforts were all in vain. The black-haired boy had watched as all his comrades killed each other mercilessly, while all he could do was watch in horror. Somehow, he had been able to escape and hide, but he had been the only one left. At least until Tanjiro and the others had found him. They were forced to kill each other. Tanjiro questioned after the black-haired boy had finished his explanation. He lowered his gaze to the ground in thought as Inosuke finally released the black-haired boy's hair. Do you think it was a demon? There's no way they would have turned on each other like that, right? Zenitsu asked, turning to Tanjiro with apprehension. The red-haired slowly nodded at his comment but didn't answer. It frightened Zenitsu at the possibility that any of them could turn on each other with their blades. Maybe he wouldn't mind giving a good punch to Inosuke, but he didn't want to ever imagine himself stabbing Tanjiro's body with his sword. How could anyone want to hurt the one that protected them? It was not something Zenitsu believed he could do. Ah! The black-haired boy in front of them gasped, pointing at the bushes behind the three boys. The trio turned, their bodies becoming tensed at what they saw. Another demon slayer was slowly walking to them, his feet treading as the leaves and twigs underneath him crackled, but there was no sign of life in his blank unmoving eyes. Although he moved with each step he took, his limbs moved awkwardly, like a puppet being pulled on strings. The boy was nothing more than a walking corpse. And soon enough, more bodies of demon slayers appeared from behind the first corpse, all gripping tightly onto their bloody swords with blank eyes. Zenitsu was surprised to hear that some of them were alive, but their heartbeats were barely audible. They were going to fade away soon. It was horrible to realize that the demon slayers that were still alive could only see themselves kill another, having no way to free themselves from the demon that had them under its control. It was a terrible thing to see before death. Zenitsu, move. Zenitsu widened his eyes and felt a calloused hand grab his arm, pulling him back as a sword struck the air where he had been standing. Trembling, he stared back at the corpse that tried to kill him, its blank eyes staring coldly right back. The unfocused eyes were quickly blocked by Tanjiro's form. The red-haired boy unsheathed his sword and positioned his arm in front of Zenitsu, staring back determinedly at the wave of corpses in front of them. Ahahaha. Inosuke laughed loudly nearby, his voice crackling from excitement. He evaded a swipe from a sword that had been aimed at his chest and followed with another dodge as another demon slayer moved forward to swipe at his neck. The pig-masked boy continued to dodge each attack with glee, until he finally kicked himself from the ground to land beside Tanjiro, positioning himself in front of the other. This bunch of people are idiots. Don't they know that it is forbidden for members to kill each other? You can't say that, you pig-head. Zenitsu snapped from behind Tanjiro, pointing at the other with annoyance. You nearly killed me weeks ago. Inosuke didn't answer, but Zenitsu could have sworn he heard a pang of regret from Inosuke's rowdy heartbeat. He figured that he only imagined it. From the few weeks they spent together at the monster lady's house, Inosuke had proven what kind of guy he was. He was prideful, arrogant, and always ready for a fight. Still, Zenitsu had to admit there were times in which Inosuke would become oddly silent every time the monster lady offered him something pleasant like food. It had to mean Inosuke was learning how to be grateful. Hopefully. Inosuke, their movements are very strange. I think their movements are being controlled by a demon. Tanjiro shouted, managing to block 2 strikes with his sword. All right. Then I'll just chop them in half right now. Inosuke replied back, waving his swords to the sky in affirmation. Zenitsu widened his eyes and took a step forward, wanting to scold Inosuke more than anything at his lack of empathy for their comrades. How could he say that when some of the demon slayers were still alive? They didn't deserve to be chopped up to pieces when their bodies were not even under their control. And there was also the fact that they shouldn't even harm the demon slayers that were already gone. Their bodies deserved to be saved without any further harm more than anything now. He couldn't stomach the idea of burying the corpses in pieces. You can't chop them in pieces. Zenitsu shouted, gritting his teeth in fury. Some of them are still alive. And you can't harm the ones that are dead. Fine, Minitsu. Inosuke grumbled in reply from underneath his mask, the sound of his rowdy heartbeat roaring in frustration. Ah! The sound of their black-haired senpai's scream rang from behind. Zenitsu watched as Tanjiro and Inosuke sprang to action, racing forward to their senpai and saving the poor boy from his 2 attackers. They brought both attackers to the ground, keeping the struggling corpses down. As Tanjiro twisted the corpse's arm back, Zenitsu caught onto something glittering in the moonlight attached to the corpse's back. It was much too thin to make out in the pure darkness, but he could see it now that he was close enough to the struggling corpse. There were thin silver wires attached to the corpse's back. And judging from Tanjiro's widened eyes, he had seen the same thing. With a quick swipe from Tanjiro's sword, the struggling corpse was released from the wires stuck to his back, falling to the ground with a deafening thud. The body no longer twitched in movement, staying perfectly still. It had been freed. It's the wires. Tanjiro shouted, looking back up from the fallen corpse. They're being controlled by the wires. It's on their backs. I've already figured that out. Inosuke retorted, much too prideful to be beaten by Tanjiro. He jumped to action and quickly cut the remaining threads that were attached to the rest of their comrades. Once freed, the bodies all fell lifelessly to the ground around them, no longer at their tormentor's control. Zenitsu stared at the bodies with remorse, glad that the battle ended quickly with no further casualties or further damage to the bodies. No one deserved what they had been put through, being pulled with wires like puppets to do a demon's bidding. He was glad that they all were finally freed. Still, what kind of demon were they facing that had this kind of ability? Was it a demon that served directly under Kibutsuji? As Zenitsu pondered over this, a sharp sound from his left made his body go rigid. Something small had jumped onto him, too small and barely noticeable. He was sure he wouldn't have heard it without his sensitive ears. Zenitsu quickly turned to see what had crawled onto his hand when he felt something yank it harshly upward, so forceful that it made him yelp out in pain. He tried to move his hand back down to his side, but the glittering silver wires that were now attached to his hand would not budge. They continued to pull his hand upward, a war that Zenitsu knew he would lose his arm for if he did not do anything in the next second. Zenitsu! Zenitsu nearly yelped again as a black sword came into his peripheral vision, swiftly swiping at the wires and freeing his hand with a snap. Zenitsu wasted no time to bring his hand to his chest, inspecting it for any injuries. While it was covered with the bandages he used for protection from the sun, it didn't mean he was protected from all other things. Still, it looked like his hand was okay for now. Wait, what was crawling by his feet? Ah! Zenitsu cried, latching onto Tanjiro's arm in terror, his feet moving rather clumsily to dodge the eight-legged creatures that moved around below him. There are spiders everywhere. They must be linked to the people controlled by the wires, Tanjiro added, turning back to the corpses that were getting back up from the ground. Zenitsu felt his chest tightened at the sound of regret that resounded from Tanjiro's heartbeat. Even if he wasn't to blame, Tanjiro still felt guilty for their comrade's situation. Tanjiro was kind, too kind to ever not feel guilty for things that were beyond his control. It felt wrong to Zenitsu for Tanjiro to want to shoulder everything, especially their comrade's body's loss of freedom. Cutting the wires won't work. Tanjiro shouted at Inosuke and their black-haired senpai. The spiders will reattach the wires. Then let's kill all these spiders. Inosuke retorted, already crushing the few that had managed to crawl near his feet. No, Inosuke. The spiders are too tiny and there are a large amount of them. We must find the demon controlling the spiders. Tanjiro explained as he dodged a deadly swing from one of the corpses, taking its attention away from Zenitsu. Inosuke, if you are able to locate the demon with precision, then dash. A sound from up above suddenly emerged, painstakingly resounding in Zenitsu's ears, contorted with cruelty and arrogance. The longer he listened, the more Zenitsu felt the panic begin to hammer in his abdomen, too unrelenting to stop. His breathing became more rapid and more shallow as the tension quickly spread to his face and limbs, his mind much too occupied with the realization of why the sound made him want to desperately run and hide. The sound belonged to a strong, ruthless demon. Zenitsu's head spun as he dared to look above, his body already taking a step backward by Tanjiro's side. The demon stood above them on two thin wires that crossed under his feet. He was much shorter than Zenitsu had expected from a ruthless monster, a child nonetheless, but the sound from his heartbeat exemplified his power. He wore a yukata that had a cobweb pattern on the bottom and was pale white with red dots styled all over his face, his hair styled in a spider-like haircut that covered his left eye. The pale blue eye of his iris residing in crimson-red sclera narrowed in disdain and annoyance. Although once the child demon's eyes landed directly onto him, Zenitsu saw a flash of emotion from the only visible eye. He immediately felt his chest tightened in terror, his hand clasping onto Tanjiro's arm, seeking the comfort of Tanjiro's heartbeat to keep him upright. He was terrified of the way the demon's one eye had looked at him. "Don't disturb our clan's peaceful life here," the demon child said, his voice soft and yet instilled with authority and power despite his small stature. "Because you will all be killed by Mother in the next few moments." The demon paused and his visible eye landed on Zenitsu's form once again. "Except for you." Before Zenitsu could react to the demon child's words, his body was suddenly yanked back, pulled away from Tanjiro into the thick vegetation behind. His desperate cries of help were useless. He could not fight the unseen force that had attached itself to his back and so easily pulled him away. All he could do was watch helplessly as Tanjiro tried to come to his aid only to be blocked by the wave of corpses that sprung forward. 2. Attack. Breath ragged and harsh, Zenitsu watched as Tanjiro, Inosuke, and even his black-haired senpai disappeared from his view, being replaced with the trees and bushes that littered the mountain. He hissed in pain as each branch that stood behind him whacked against his body, sending flares of pain to every limb. It seemed like whatever had latched onto him and pulled him back did not care about his well-being. Zenitsu almost gave a sigh of relief once the constant torrent of whack stopped, but it came with the realization that he had finally come to a stop. Ears ringing, he moved his head around, shakily taking in his new surroundings. Zenitsu was now in a clearing, suspended in the air by the wires that had most likely snatched him away from his companions. There were wires attached to every limb and Zenitsu was sure to his back as well, prohibiting him from making any movement. The only thing he could move was his head. He felt slight movement from the back of his neck, most likely belonging to Chuntaro. He could hear the sparrow chirping softly. Zenitsu was glad that the sparrow was with him. He had no idea how much more terrified he would be if he was alone. Listening to the sparrow's worried chirps, Zenitsu allowed himself to look around once more, his eyes finally looking up above where a lone wooden house stood, kept above by the wires that were attached to all around it. Bodies of demon slayers surrounded the wooden structure as well, tied by the same wires that were now attached to him. Zenitsu stared at the bodies with wide eyes, his breathing becoming rapid with panic. Some of the bodies were normal, but there were those that had shrunken bodies and spider legs that replaced the limbs. He nearly gasped as his ears began to listen without his permission to the heartbeat inside the wooden structure. It was not as excruciating to listen to as the demon child's heartbeat, but the sound still belonged to a malevolent demon nonetheless. And it was slowly making its way down towards him. Pure terror surged through Zenitsu's veins upon the sight of the demon that descended from the house. It was a giant spider with a human head and it was sadistically smirking back at him. The demon slowly made it stop in front of him, its sound nearly sending Zenitsu reeling in shock from its proximity. It was a wonder how his ears haven't bled yet from all the contorted sounds he had been forced to hear since entering the mountain. It was all too much for his sensitive ears. Kofu. What do we have here? A new demon hunter to join my collection of slaves? The demon smiled widely, twisted in the way he curled his lips, sending another wave of terror down Zenitsu's spine. He wanted to escape, but he knew the demon would laugh at his struggle. And even then, he was sure he didn't have the courage or strength to run. No, that can't be it. The demon muttered oddly with satisfaction. That weak mother wouldn't have you my way with her threads if you were just another demon hunter, not with Roy watching. Which means... The demon moved closer to Zenitsu, nearly an inch away from his face, its eyes staring back at his trembling form with amusement. Roy sent you to me. Not giving Zenitsu the chance to react, the demon smacked Zenitsu's mask away from his face, ripping away the only source of protection Zenitsu had from both the sun and from any demon that would laugh away at his visible fear. He gazed back helplessly, completely breathless, as the spider demon took in all his demon features, his wide smile quickly growing by the second. Ahahaha. A demon? The spider demon erupted with laughter. Two of his furry legs pressed themselves onto Zenitsu's cheeks and forcibly turned his head to the side, further studying his demon features. To think a demon hunter would be turned into a demon, the very thing you hunters are sworn to kill. Tell me, how did it feel when those you fought with turned their blades onto you? Did you kill them all before finding your way here? No. Zenitsu shouted, whipping his head back forward, his eyes glaring back in defiance even though he could feel the salty tears leaking through. He knew he was a demon, but he never would hurt a human, especially a demon slayer. He still wanted to cling to the thought that he still was a member of the Demon Slayer Corps. And as a member, it was forbidden for him to hurt another comrade. No. The demon questioned, the sound of his heartbeat shifting in irritation. He narrowed his eyes and brought his face closer to Zenitsu, eyes glinting coldly back. You can't be serious. Are you saying you still consider yourself a demon hunter? The spider demon spat. The spider demon raised its leg and pulled onto the wire that was attached to Zenitsu's right arm, yanking it forward harshly. Zenitsu could not keep in the cry of anguish that made its way from his mouth as unbearable heat spread up from his arm to his hand, followed by a loud pop. He could feel his arm slowly reattach itself to its socket, but the constant throbbing could not stop him from squeezing his eyes shut to mask the pain. Kofu. If you were human, you wouldn't have been able to recover so quickly from such an injury. The spider demon's voice resounded with bemusement, obviously enjoying the torment it inflicted upon Zenitsu. Quit lying to yourself that you are a demon hunter. It's useless for you to act like you are still one of them. They will kill you if you don't kill them first. That's not true. Zenitsu forced himself to reply back, teeth chattering in an effort to keep his jaw still. He could hear the spider demon's sound shifted in pitch at his answer, becoming distorted with deep annoyance. He knew immediately that he had said the wrong thing. Before Zenitsu could react, the spider demon grabbed onto each wire attached to all four of his limbs and pulled them with such force that it sent Zenitsu reeling back as black spots clouded his vision. He could hear a sharp ringing sound invading his thoughts, becoming louder before it finally stopped with several loud pops. Zenitsu could faintly hear someone screaming in the distance. It wasn't until he felt how hoarse his throat was after the screaming had ceased that he realized he had been the one who had screamed. Gasping for air, Zenitsu desperately tried to ease the searing pain that emerged from each socket of his limbs. It was aggravating, but he could already feel his body begin to pull each bone back to where they belonged. Still, it came at the expense of his energy. Zenitsu was terrified of the idea of what would become of him if the demon continuously tried to injure him. He was a demon, but a weak one at that. There was only so much his body could handle before it would give up in healing his injuries until he consumed more human blood. He had to find a way to escape before that happened. Kofufu, you are just as bad as mother. The spider demon spoke, his voice laced with cruelty. It sickened Zenitsu that the spider demon was enjoying hurting him. Then again, what was Zenitsu supposed to expect from any demon? She can't take a hit from father without breaking down in tears. The demon continued with a slight chuckle, mouth curving upward in thought. I wonder what kind of human you were. It seems like a coward given how you won't fight back. You're quite useless, aren't you? The demon leaned closer, a sadistic grin adorned on his face. But you know, there's nothing to be afraid of. You can devour all the humans you want here. You can even make those demon hunters pay for turning their backs away from you. I know you want that. Even you can't be stupid to understand that. You're their enemy, now their prey. It's only right you pay them back. Zenitsu swallowed, finding that he couldn't speak. The demon was right about him being a coward. It was the one thing that still stuck even beyond his transformation into a monster. And he hated himself for this. He wanted to be a proper human being and prove that he could save others. And yet, he would run and cry instead at any sight of a demon. And even then, he always had to be saved by someone, from Gramps, Tanjiro, Nezuko, and Shoichi. He couldn't think of a time in which he managed to protect someone else. He was useless, so pathetically useless in what he couldn't do for others. He never could change. But the spider demon was wrong about him not having to be afraid. He was still afraid of many things, not knowing if Tanjiro and Inosuke were safe, for all the demon slayer's members that were tied up around him, and still for the corpses that he had been forced to leave behind that were probably still being used as puppets. Of all the things he was afraid of, none of his fears directly involved his own safety. Zenitsu didn't have the heart to believe that he mattered anyway. But the reality that as a demon, he was the demon slayer core enemy wouldn't sink in. No matter how much the spider demon pushed the idea to him, Zenitsu still wouldn't accept it. He wanted to change and do things properly, a goal he had long set out for himself after being taken in by Gramps. Since then, his goal had only become muddled by his fears and anxieties, soon becoming impossible for Zenitsu to want to achieve. He had changed, but not the way he wanted. And now, all he could do was try to be a proper human. He knew there were going to be those that would not accept him, especially those from the Demon Slayer Corps. He was taking a gamble staying with Tanjiro and the others. He knew that at any moment, he could be killed for what he had become by any member. There was no denying that they had the right to behead him. It was one of the reasons he had been so frightened at first to leave the disheveled house he had found shelter in before Tanjiro had found him. He had been afraid to face that kind of reality. But it was different now. There were those that believed in him and didn't see him as a monster. Despite everything, Zenitsu felt more sure than ever that he could never hurt a Demon Slayer Corps member. Besides, he was never a proper demon to begin with. Kufufu. Did you finally get it what you are? The spider demon asked as he leaned forward to Zenitsu. You must be starving him. Since I'm feeling generous, I'll let you kill a few of my slaves. After all, I can always get dash. Chun. Zenitsu widened his eyes as Chuntaro suddenly swooped in from behind him and gorged its beak into the spider demon's left eye, tearing into it with no remorse for the demon. With a flap of their wings, it left the spider demon to pull away and scream at his wound and flew back to Zenitsu's side. Zenitsu watched as the loyal sparrow made haste with the precious time it had obtained and cut through the silver threads attached to Zenitsu with its beak. When the last wire had been finally cut, Zenitsu felt gravity take over and felt his body plummet to the ground below. He landed harshly on his back, not being able to stop the tears that made their way down his cheeks at the flare of pain that erupted from his aching back. Despite this, he still pushed his body up from the ground. Being on the ground was better than being immobilized and tormented by the spider demon above him. He was all the more grateful for having Chuntaro there to help him. Thank you, Chuntaro, Zenitsu breathed in gratitude, as the small sparrow landed on his shoulder, rubbing its cheek assiduously onto his own cheek. He noticed that the sparrow took special care to not rub the blood that now covered its beak onto him, something that he took gratitude in. The sparrow cooed and took off from his shoulder to the sky, disappearing into the branches of a tree nearby. Although the tiny sparrow was no longer in sight, Zenitsu could hear the sparrow's heart still beating. He had no doubt Chuntaro would rush forward to help him if needed. And although he wanted the sparrow's help, he couldn't imagine what the spider demon would do to the loyal bird if it was seen again. He couldn't stand the idea of seeing another bird being torn to shreds because it tried to save him. He didn't want to see that again. What the hell? The spider demon spat above him, now glaring down at him with his newly regenerated eye. Demon or not, you're going to pay for that. Pounce on him. Zenitsu's ears screamed at him to move and he did not hesitate to react. With a kick from his legs, he sloppily moved to the right, watching as three spider-like creatures with human heads shot at the spot he had been standing at with a stinger attached to their tongues. He stared at the creatures in horror, recognizing the same features he had seen on some of the demon slayers tied up above him. Was this what the spider demon meant by SLV? Is this what he turned any member he managed to catch into? The idea sickened Zenitsu, almost making him reel back from the shock of the realization. Ouch! Zenitsu suddenly cried, pulling his hand away from whatever had bitten him. He looked down, horrified to see that one of the spider-like creatures had snuck up from behind. It stared back at him with empty eyes, mouth opened with its tongue hanging from it as dark purple liquid trickled off the stinger. Zenitsu shakily lifted his hand up to his face, widening his eyes at the sight of the abnormal swelling. Kufufu. A demon should heal from poison in a few seconds, the demon said above him with a grin, his eyes glinting with maliciousness. I've tried with Mother before, but she always recovered before the dizziness set in. However, I've never had a demon injected with my venom more than once in seconds. I wonder how much a useless demon like you can take before you succumb to it. Will you lose your brain like my slaves here? The spider demon cackled with laughter, his mouth widening with crazed excitement. I don't think Rue will mind if I have some fun with you. Since you still want to believe that you're a demon hunter, then I'll make sure you'll suffer like one. Stab him with more venom. Zenitsu yelped in terror as his sensitive ears alerted him to move. He clumsily stepped to the side, barely avoiding a pair of stingers that launched out at him. He moved to avoid more of the deadly stingers, but despite his effort, he was not fast enough to avoid them all. He could feel a stinger sink itself deeply into his shoulder with several more not too far behind. He hissed in pain, tumbling to the ground and feeling the cold ground pressed against his face, as his body became paralyzed with terror and panic. He gritted his teeth and tried to move to get back up, hearing more of the spider-like creatures already pouncing onto him, but his body would not respond. All he could do was scream as more stingers pierced into his skin, not being to ignore the crackles of laughter above him, taking satisfaction in his suffering. He could feel searing hot pain quickly spread throughout his body, which forced Zenitsu to squeeze his eyes tightly shut in an effort to cope with the unbearable pain. He tried to move his limbs once more, but his limbs were now too numb to respond to his thoughts. Soon, he realized it didn't matter any longer. He couldn't make a coherent thought with his throbbing head. A crushing pain was pounding against his skull, too unrelenting to stop. At that moment, Zenitsu knew that there was no possible way for his body to recover. He gasped for air, already feeling the hot salty tears stream down his cheeks as all his fears instantly weighed down on his conscience. Zenitsu wanted to be protected. He desperately wanted someone to protect him, but Tanjiro, Nezuko, and even Inosuke were not there to help him. Even Chuntaro couldn't help him. No one could. Zenitsu was utterly alone. And Zenitsu was not ashamed to realize that he accepted that. It was a fitting end for him, really. There was no point for him to even try to fight to live when no one expected him to accomplish anything to begin with. Even as a human, all he ever did was run and cry. Tanjiro assured him countless times that this didn't matter, but Zenitsu knew there was no point in curing a mistake like him. Turning into a demon only seemed to solidify the fact that he was a coward. Still, he couldn't stop the pang of regret at the idea that wasn't able to protect the ones that had found him. He wanted to protect them just as they have done so for him. I'm sorry. Tanjiro, Nezuko-chan. Zenitsu whispered, his voice barely audible as a wave of dizziness overtook his thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm not strong enough to protect you guys. With those words, Zenitsu allowed his consciousness to fade to the darkness awaiting him, letting himself fall finally to a world of dreams. Only, it was never over in his dreams. In his dreams, he could fight. Oh make Zenitsu! Tanjiro screamed, swiftly dodging an attack from a sword that had been aimed at his neck. He moved to follow where Zenitsu had been dragged away to, but was promptly stopped by a group of corpses, all aiming their sword at him. He felt his body shake with worry and fury. He was wasting time. The longer he was occupied, the further Zenitsu would be taken. While he had no idea what the demon wanted with Zenitsu, he was not going to waste precious time to save him. He promised he would protect Zenitsu. Kentaro, Manitsu will be fine. He's a demon. He'll survive whatever they decide to do to him. Inosuke shouted from Tanjiro's side, kicking himself from the ground to the air, effectively avoiding the swipe of swords around him. But Tanjiro started to say, but he was cut off from their senpai. A demon? Their black-haired senpai called out, his eyes nearly bulging out in terror at Inosuke's words. You're telling me that guy that was taken was a demon? Why is he with you too? He could have attacked any of us. Tanjiro felt his body go still, his eyes already narrowing at their senpai. He knew that their senpai had every right to be scared of Zenitsu, but it still felt wrong. Zenitsu had proven that he would never hurt anyone. He was kind, always putting others before himself. Never once in any sort of danger did Zenitsu only think about himself. He always thought of others. For that, Tanjiro instantly wanted to deny their senpai's words. However, Before Tanjiro could even get one word out, Inosuke had already rushed forward and slammed his fist into their senpai's face for the second time of the day. Oi! Zenitsu may be a demon. Inosuke huffed, his voice surprisingly filled with fury. But he's our comrade. The hot-headed boy grabbed onto a fistful of the boy's hair and pulled him harshly forward to his mask, his unmoving eyes staring coldly back. So what if Chuitsu's a demon? Zenitsu is not pointless like you. Please, Tanjiro interrupted as he blocked a strike from a sword from his left. Zenitsu is not like other demons. He would never hurt us. The black-haired senpai stared back in silence before releasing a heavy sigh, moving his hand to wipe away a streak of blood that had slowly trickled from his mouth. Fine. He replied as Inosuke finally released him. But you two have some explaining to do. Thank you, Tanjiro spoke, grateful for their senpai's agreement to listen. It was not much, but it was all he needed for now. On the other note, it was time that they put a stop to the demon that was moving the corpses around them with the wires. They still needed to find Zenitsu. Inosuke, can you locate where the demon controlling the wires? Tanjiro yelled to the pig-headed boy. Ah. I get it. All right. Inosuke yelled back in annoyance, shaking his swords furiously at Tanjiro. You're so DMN annoying, Santaro. Tanjiro ignored Inosuke's comment and continued his focus on blocking every sword that moved to swipe at him or Inosuke. Too much time had already been wasted, and although he knew he shouldn't be impatient helping the corpses around them be set free from the demon controlling them, he still wanted to find Zenitsu. Found it. Inosuke roared back, waving his sword boisterously at the thick bushes nearby them. Tanjiro nodded in gratitude and narrowed his eyes locking in the direction Inosuke pointed at. It was time for them to move. Get lost. Zenitsu flinched at the callousness of the voice that had addressed him, but he made no effort to turn away. Gramps had ordered him and the older black-haired boy in front of him to spend time together training, and while Zenitsu would love nothing more than to train alone by himself, Zenitsu didn't have the heart to disobey his Gramps. He had no longing to after hearing all the old man had done for him after Zenitsu had been struck by lightning. Gramps had stayed with him and tended to him while he had been in a coma for a few days. Zenitsu still had no idea how he was alive to begin with. Being struck by lightning should have meant his immediate death, and yet, here he was still alive, living a hellish life under Gramps' training regime once more. The lightning strike was still fresh on Zenitsu's mind. He couldn't forget the raw searing pain that had coursed through his limbs along with the horrible stench of burning flesh. His brain never seemed to stop replaying the sound of booming thunder following the strike every night, waking him up like clockwork from dreams that were his only way of escape from everything that plagued him during the day. No matter how much he tried, he couldn't forget. Even his appearance was a reminder of what happened to him as well. Sure, he could hide the ugly crude scars that now traced along his back, but the yellow hair was permanent. And Zenitsu hated it. It didn't take Zenitsu too long to find out what happened after he had woken up from his short coma. Being struck by lightning called for immediate medical attention. From what he understood, his stern Gramps had been frantic, scared even that he would lose Zenitsu, and had called for the best doctor to come. While Zenitsu's burns were treatable, the doctor could not treat his comatose state. Still, that didn't deter Gramps from believing that Zenitsu would wake up. The old man had stubbornly stayed by Zenitsu's side, taking care of the yellow-haired boy while he slept. Normally, Zenitsu would have been giddy for the attention, but he disliked how the attention from Gramps impacted his other disciple. His other disciple loathed every moment Gramps spent on him. Zenitsu was sure that the older black-haired boy cursed the fact that he was even still alive. Since meeting him, Gramps' disciple never tried to hide his hatred and animosity for Zenitsu. Every training session they had together, the black-haired boy practically sneered down on him, always flaunting his skills. Proudly. Of the breathing techniques he had already learned while never missing the opportunity to mistreat Zenitsu with his venomous words. If Zenitsu had to guess, the older boy had probably been initially excited at the news that he had been struck by lightning. After all, with his death, Gramps wouldn't have to waste any more of his precious time on him and instead focus on his more successful disciple. Yet, Zenitsu had miraculously survived. And now, it seemed like the other disciple despised him even more now than before the lightning incident. Zenitsu had done his best to avoid the older boy as much as he could, but Gramps' stern morning lecture of getting along with his superior continued to echo in his head. Maybe that was why Zenitsu found himself not being able to turn away at the sight of the narrowed eyes glaring at him with such animosity. He wanted to make his Gramps proud. It was the least he could do for all the trouble he had put his Gramps through. "Aren't you embarrassed?" The older boy glowered, snapping Zenitsu from his thoughts. The yellow-haired boy blinked, his eyes wandering to the peach the older boy held in his hand as the black-haired boy took a bite out of the delicate pink fruit. The two were in a small clearing surrounded by peach trees that belonged to Gramps. If there was one thing Zenitsu loved about his Gramps' estate, it was the large orchid that surrounded it. The smell of peaches was a surprisingly pleasant scent, something that Zenitsu found himself slowly getting used to. Of course, one of his chores included tending to the peach trees, but Zenitsu didn't seem to mind. Something about the pink fruit just made it feel that he was now at home. If only the black-haired boy treated Gramps' beloved peach trees with the same amount of respect Zenitsu showed for them. Gramps obviously loved his peach trees. He wouldn't have had so many if he didn't like them. And it was their job as his disciples to show respect to his property. This thought continued to echo in Zenitsu's head as the older disciple continued to speak. "From morning to night, you cry like a sheep. And still, you have the audacity to think you can train with me when all you have done is whine. Get lost. You don't belong here." Zenitsu knew that. It always felt like he didn't belong. He was too much of a crybaby to become a swordsman. He was not inherently strong like Gramps' other disciple. The older boy could do 5 breathing styles perfectly, while all Zenitsu had managed to do was learn only one. It just wasn't enough for him to take on any demon, but Gramps was resilient. He reassured Zenitsu that it was fine that he could only learn one breathing technique. It only meant that he could break the limits associated with the technique he had learned. Of course, when the older disciple had learned what breathing technique Zenitsu had managed to only pick up on, he had been livid with fury. It was the breathing technique that he could not even learn, the first of the Breath of Thunder styles. Zenitsu initially was excited that he had been able to learn at least the first breathing technique, but nothing could prepare him for the other disciple's wrath. He verbally attacked him whenever Gramps was not around, calling him even more vulgar words that did no good for Zenitsu's already low self-esteem. Soon, even Zenitsu found himself beginning to loathe the fact that he had learned the first breathing style. It had already hurt that he couldn't learn the other breathing techniques, but he found it stung even more that he could only learn the easiest and simplest of the breathing styles. What good was there to learn only one, the foundation of the other 5, when it was weak in comparison? "Sensei is an amazing person," the other disciple continued, his eyes narrowing, rigid, cold, and hard. "To think he wastes his time on someone like you is unimaginable. Aren't you ashamed of it?" But Ji-chan Zenitsu started to argue, no longer being able to hold in his tongue, but a peach immediately collided with his head, shutting him up. He let his gaze trail to the ground in complete silence, fingers digging into his clothing as Gramps' other disciple further verbally assaulted him with even more hatred ringing through his voice. "You brat. Don't call Sensei Ji-chan as if you're familiar with him. He is a Hashira, a person who received the title of the strongest demon hunter. It's rare to even receive instruction from a former pillar. And yet here you are, completely disrespecting him and continuing to be ungrateful." Zenitsu felt his body shiver as the sound of the disciples beat louder, rage and animosity building up in rhythm. As far as sounds go, the sounds that were full of anger and hatred were the ones that Zenitsu disliked the most to listen to. He had encountered too many of those types of sounds during his time as an orphan on the streets. Not too many people took kindly to orphans. However, Gramps' older disciple was by far the worse. The level of animosity in the disciple's sound terrified Zenitsu. Not only because of how loud it sounded but also because of how overpowering it was. It was the type of sound that made sure to block any sound of happiness that should exist, condemning Zenitsu's ears to negative pitches of disharmonious rhythm. You're an eyesore. A mistake. I can't believe Sensei has spent all this time on you when you're still completely useless. Why are you here? Why do you still cling to the idea that you can stay? You don't belong. Disappear. Zenitsu continued to keep his gaze solely at the ground, watching as the peach that had been thrown at him finally slid from his head, landing with a deafening splat. He stayed silent as the other disciple continued to insult him for a few more minutes before finally deciding to leave the small clearing. It was only after Zenitsu could no longer hear the other disciple's heartbeat that his legs finally gave out, sending him crashing to the ground. He wanted to cry and to scream but nothing came out. All he could do was silently stare at the fruit that lay before him. Perhaps the other disciple was right that all the time Gramps had spent on him was useless. Zenitsu certainly felt like he wasn't making any progress. Certainly, it would have been better if he had died when he had been struck by lightning. Maybe then, it wouldn't feel like Gramps was wasting his time on someone like him. After all, nobody ever expected Zenitsu to amount to anything to begin with. He was an orphan, cast away by parents he never got the chance to know while being forced to survive on his own in the dirty streets in the small town he stayed in. It wasn't expected that an orphan could amount to anything to even have a chance to accomplish any dream. And yet, Gramps had chosen him. Of all the orphans that were out there, Gramps had decided to take him in. But for what reason, he still couldn't understand. What are you doing out here by yourself, boy? Zenitsu widened his eyes and whirled around, his mouth gaping wide as his eyes met the narrowed eyes of his MSTR. It was funny how he was thinking about the old man and he happened to be there right behind him. Zenitsu shivered under the hardened gaze of his Gramps. Of course, he had become more used to Gramps' iron gaze, but he still jumped up in fright from time to time whenever Gramps' eyes landed on him. It was probably something he would never learn to react normally to. Well? Are you going to answer? Gramps spoke, his voice echoing like thunder. Nearly. Sending Zenitsu over, shocking him from his thoughts. Ah. I was just thinking. Zenitsu clumsily answered, pausing as he tried to think of any other excuse that would not make the old man suspicious. Where is Kaigaku? Zenitsu felt his eyes widened at the old man's question, his thoughts coming to a complete halt. How was he going to answer that? He was supposed to be training with the other disciple. And given how he already reacted to the question, he was already too suspicious. He knew even if he answered with a lie, Gramps would see right through it. Ah, but wait, that didn't mean he couldn't partially respond with a half-lie. It was better than telling the full truth. He couldn't tell Gramps that his other disciple had disobeyed his order for them to train together. He left. Zenitsu decided to answer, his mind quickly coming with the first excuse he could think of. He wanted to train more by himself. Gramps stared back, eyes narrowing slightly. He was silent except for the sound of his booming heart pounding in loud beats. The two stared at each other in silence for a few seconds before finally, the old man broke off eye contact, sighing deeply. Again, he looked back at Zenitsu, but Zenitsu could see that they had softened slightly. If that is the case, then I will continue overseeing your training for the rest of the day. Get up, Zenitsu. You will start off from where you left off yesterday. Knowing that any denial to follow his grandfather's orders would earn him a whack on his head from Gramps' infamous cane, Zenitsu moved to get off the ground. He started to follow Gramps to their usual training spot, but froze, his eyes gazing back at the discarded peach that was still laid on the ground behind him. He couldn't help but relate to the peach and how it was quickly thrown away by Gramps' other disciple. The thought that he could be discarded by Gramps for his failure to learn the rest of the breathing styles besides the first one had crossed his mind before, but staring at the deformed Peach seemed to only solidify the idea of how broken he would be if that were to happen. It was scary to admit it, but he had become fond of Gramps and his tiny estate that was surrounded by his peach orchard. Sure, Gramps' training regime was hellish and he was incredibly frightened of the idea of fighting monsters that feasted on humans. However, he actually had a home and someone that cared for him for once in his life. Maybe, just for once, he could make that someone that cared for him proud. Ji-chan, Zenitsu quietly spoke, his voice surprisingly soft, but clear. Why did you become a demon slayer? The old man raised his eyebrows, noticeably surprised that Zenitsu asked such a question. Zenitsu had asked countless questions of what a demon slayer was and what was expected of them, but the thought of why Gramps had chosen such an occupation never crossed his mind. It was a surprising question, really now of all times, but the way Gramps seemed to react stirred something in Zenitsu. He needed to understand what it meant. I'm shocked that you would ask this, Zenitsu, the old man said, his lips curling up fondly. It does my old heart good to know that there is at least one disciple that is interested to know why I picked up the blade to fight. However, if I have to be honest, I have forgotten over the years why I decided to do so. Wait, you can't be serious. You can't forget such a thing, Ji-chan. There has to be a reason. You couldn't have possibly just decided on a whim. There's no such dash. Quiet boy. Gramps said, whacking Zenitsu on the head with his cane, although not as hard as usual, which promptly shut the yellow-haired boy up. I may have forgotten why I initially became a demon slayer, but the feelings I can still recall: admiration, pride, resent, foolishness. In fact, I can even recall fear propelling me to become a demon slayer. But shouldn't brave people only be a demon slayer? Zenitsu, anyone who faces a demon and says they are not afraid is a fool. Yes, fear can make you overly cautious and it can indeed make you doubt your abilities, but it can also spur you to fight. Gramps paused and took a step forward, his eyes sternly gazing down into Zenitsu's own pair of eyes. That is why it is okay to be afraid, Zenitsu. It is okay that you want to scream and cry and run away. However, you must also remember that you should never let your fear cause you to turn a blind eye to protecting someone from a demon. A demon slayer serves to protect just as well as they fight with their blade. You must never forget that. Zenitsu found himself nodding to his Gramps' words in complete silence, unable to say anything in reply. It was a funny idea to have and maybe something he shouldn't even think of having, but it would be nice if he could be the one protecting instead of cowering, wouldn't it? Everything was pitch black. There were no demons or spider creatures that made Zenitsu want to cower in fear and cry out for his misfortune. There were no dark looming forests nor the familiar, but daunting glow of the moon from above. No, all there was complete darkness. And yet, Zenitsu could still see just as clearly. Zenitsu felt the air slam against him as he stepped to the side, hearing the crash echo from his left where the swarm of spider creatures collided with the ground. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them and that was more than enough. He shifted his body, lowering his body slightly, his hand already poised over the sheath of his sword. He prepared to put his focus onto his breathing, but a sharp sound from his left sent him jumping to the side yet again. He could feel his body cry out in agony from the sudden movement, his lungs screaming at him to stop. But he couldn't. Here, now more than ever, this was where he could fight. What are you doing? Get him! The spider demon cried out from above. Gramps! Zenitsu swiveled his body away in one fluid move from the roaring sound that had sped towards him, once again lowering his body into the right position. He inhaled deeply, a hiss of steam emitting from his exhale as he focused all his strength to his legs. Nezuko-chan. Waves of fiery pain shot through Zenitsu's body. He could feel the stingers from the spider creatures once again puncture his skin, this time at his right calf. He could not stop the torrent of blood that made its way out of his mouth nor stop his body from leaning over in exhaustion. Yet, the adrenaline was still there. And for that reason, no matter how much he was in pain, he would bear it. Tanjiro. Teeth gritting, Zenitsu inhaled deeply, listening to the hiss of steam that released from his exhale. He could feel his body tingle, tension moving through his body like electricity, but he was just as calm and still as ever. Tightening his grip on his sword, Zenitsu finally allowed himself to say the words his grandfather drilled to his head, the words of the sword technique he had learned all on his own after many months of nothing but failure. Thunder breathing, first form, thunder flash sixfold. And Zenitsu shot forward, leaving only a clap of thunder behind. His feet collided into the trunks of nearby trees, propelling him closer to his target above. He could hear the spider demon shouting in shock before retreating to the small house suspended in the air, but it was of no use. Lightning never missed. He never missed. It only took a second for the spider demon's head to be cleanly sliced off from its body. The spider demon's frustrations rang from below. Its head cursing at him for siding with the demon hunters as Zenitsu crashed onto the house suspended in the air. But the curses soon receded until finally, all that remained was silence, ashes scattering to the passing wind. The demon was gone. At last, Zenitsu allowed himself to cough, blood splattering from his mouth. His breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps as his thoughts continued to race in his aching head. All too quickly, fear and anxiety began to kick in as the realization that he was not healing fast enough made itself known. Zenitsu wondered if it was because he had been injected too many times with poison and forced to fight in such a condition. Surely, a normal demon would not be in such pain, but then again, he wasn't a normal demon. He was a demon that was losing the battle to stay awake. Ever so slowly, Zenitsu gave in to his selfish longing. He allowed his eyes to shut to the world around him to dream once more. I'm having another dream. A happy dream. One in which I'm the strongest, stronger than anyone. I always help those weaker than me and those that are in trouble. A dream in which I'm not a demon, just me, making Gramps proud. All the time he spent on me was never a waste. And a dream in which I'm protecting my friends. I'm the one protecting instead of cowering. Yes, a happy dream. Please, just let me dream once more. Chun. Zenitsu felt something poke softly at his cheek, forcing him to open his eyelids. He blinked as the pale light of the moon from above penetrated his vision, making his vision blur. Slowly, a brown object entered his unfocused gaze, flapping wings much too fast for Zenitsu to process. Zenitsu blinked a few times, eyebrows furrowing until finally, he could make out what he was seeing. Chuntaro had never left him. See Chuntaro? Zenitsu managed to say before erupting into a fit of coughs, feeling more blood dribble from his mouth. He squeezed his eyes shut in a grimace, lungs practically begging for him to remain still. Everything ached and he could barely let alone breathe. Why wasn't he healing? Chun. Zenitsu felt something tap his cheek. He opened his eyes, finding Chuntaro waving a small vial gripped tightly from its feet. The sparrow continued waving it erratically, speaking in chirps, desperately trying its best to get Zenitsu to stay focused on it. Zenitsu stared at the sparrow in a daze, but slowly he began to realize what the sparrow had for him. Chuntaro had a vial of blood for him to consume. Before Zenitsu could even think to thank Chuntaro, the sparrow moved the vial of blood to his mouth, chirping loudly, forcing him to stay silent. Despite not being able to understand it, Zenitsu knew what the sparrow was saying. Its tiny heart was erratically beating in concern and worry for him. The sparrow would not allow him to speak again before at least taking some of the blood. Zenitsu almost laughed at the irony of being saved by the sparrow when he should be the one taking care of himself, but he was all the more grateful to have Chuntaro. It truly was a loyal bird, much like that of the Kasugai crows. Tears pricking his eyes, Zenitsu lifted his hand to take the vial from Chuntaro. He struggled a bit, but he managed to open the vial on his own and pour its content to his mouth, swallowing it in one gulp. He couldn't help but shiver at the taste of it, but he was quick to bite his tongue at this unwanted thought. He would never allow himself to drink more than he needed, but for now, he needed the blood to heal from his wounds. It only took a few seconds for the numbness to fade from Zenitsu's limbs. The searing pain from his lungs dulled down until eventually, it became a gentle hum. Slowly, Zenitsu lifted himself up and exhaled, his lungs complying with no trace of pain in each breath he took. He brought his hand to his mouth and wiped away the blood he knew was still there and looked up at Chuntaro gratefully. "Thank you, Chuntaro." The sparrow chirped loudly in response, before diving down to Zenitsu's head, burying its face into his untamed hair. Zenitsu smiled slightly and glanced around, realizing that he was still on top of the suspended house. He opted to ignore this for a second, in fear of the panic of not being able to get down, and instead closed his eyes, allowing himself to listen to below. The spider creatures were still down below him on the ground, but they were still, as they no longer served a MSTR, lost in thoughts of what they had become. Zenitsu decided to pay no mind to them. Instead, he shifted his focus on the forest around him. It was supposed to be alive with the familiar sounds it made, but it was odd how quiet it was. Sure, the spider demon he had faced had filled the clearing with his twisted sound, but there were still sounds from everything around him. The fight was over, so there should be reassuring sounds to greet him from the trees and plants nearby, but the silence was all there was. Zenitsu felt his body tremble as he realized what this meant. Something was there, watching him. Closer now. He had to move. Zenitsu nearly fell over the suspended house as a thin red thread shot at the spot he had been on. He stared wide-eyed, trembling at the red thread, noting its sickly crimson color all being too similar to blood. Again, his ears alerted him to another thread propelling forward at him and he wasted no time to move. Zenitsu shifted his body to the side, evading the foreboding thread. Before he could even think of his next course of action, more threads began to shoot at him at alarming speeds from all around. Zenitsu evaded every thread, but it was not too hard to see that he was being caged in by the threads. Every thread he dodged meant another that would surround him, keeping him caged into whoever sent them. Ears ringing, Zenitsu moved to dodge another thread, but a sharp pain from his ankle sent him crashing to what little floor he had to keep him from falling to the ground below. Teeth gritting, he moved to see what had caused his ankle to flare up in pain, only to see a dark thread looped around the bleeding ankle linked to the tree in front of him. Panic immediately began to set in Zenitsu's hammering heart knowing that he had been caught. He moved to grab his sword to slice the thread, but it was too late. The thread pulled him harshly back into the dark creaking trees awaiting him to swallow him whole. Zenitsu hissed as every branch he moved past whacked against his body. Grimacing, he moved to try to grab his sword again, but his attempt seemed to only earn him another whack to the face with a branch. Before long, Zenitsu found himself crashing to the ground, finally getting the chance to grab his sword. But his body immediately froze as a familiar but unwanted sound entered his eardrums. His breathing became more rapid, more shallow as the panic and terror began to set in. He dared to look at what he knew awaited him, finding the same demon that had separated him from Tanjiro and the others, gazing at him coldly with its visible eye. Attached to his hand was the same crimson thread that had grabbed Zenitsu and pulled him away. Zenitsu began to find it difficult to breathe. The eye was too cold and cruel. Even though the demon had the appearance of a child, Zenitsu could tell that the child had killed many. The sound was too twisted in disharmonious rhythm for a normal child's heart to have. But it made Zenitsu also wonder. What could have made a child turn into a monster like this? You killed my older brother, which means you are strong. The demon remarked tonelessly, his voice conveying no sign of grief or even anger at Zenitsu's actions. Zenitsu said nothing, remaining silent in fear of what his response would make the demon do to him. This only made the demon continue to speak. And yet, you wear the same clothes those demon hunters wear. Why is that? Silence ticked by with neither of the two speaking. The demon seemed to only stare back, but Zenitsu heard the faintest click of annoyance from the demon. No matter. You will join my family. I need a strong older brother to protect my family. You will do. Family? Zenitsu stuttered in confusion. I don't understand. Really, of all the things he feared the demon would say, he had not expected this. The demon only stared coldly back, his eye unrelenting in his piercing gaze. There is no need for you to understand. You are a demon and demon hunters will hunt you down. Here, I offer protection. All you have to do is join my family and do what I say. That is the only choice you have. Despite what the demon was offering, there was no sincerity in the demon's words. For a demon on the run and desperate enough to do anything to stay safe from demon hunters, following the demon's demand made sense. But that was not Zenitsu. He wasn't like any other demon. And the demon must have known that Zenitsu understood this, which is why he didn't give him the choice to decline. Rue. Zenitsu snapped from his thoughts, his eyes trailing over to another demon running towards the two from behind, her breathing heavy and erratic. Like the demon in front of him, she was similar in appearance. It didn't take Zenitsu too long to determine that she was part of the demon's family. And yet, Zenitsu could hear the fear in each breath she took as she stopped in front of the demon. She was scared of him. So then, were they really family? Rue, they've beaten mother and big brother. What should we do? The demon slayers are dash. The female demon stopped speaking, her eyes finally coming to a stop at Zenitsu. She stared at him, her eyes slowly widening in utter confusion. She switched her gaze back to the other demon, Rue, apprehension clearly seen in her expression. Rue, why is he here? He's a dash. This is our new older brother. The demon cut in, not even caring that he had interrupted the other. Brother? But what about Dash? Our last older brother was weak. I have no need for a brother that can't do his part to protect our family. Are you implying you have objections to this? The female demon widened her eyes, ball of sweat running down from her forehead to her cheeks as clear panic set in. She quickly shook her head and hands back and forth in an effort to deny what Rue remarked. Of course not, Rue. It's just that he looks like he's part of those demon slayers. He's wearing their clothes and is even carrying a sword. Rue silently looked back at Zenitsu, his visible eye showing no hint of emotion. Slowly, the rigid eye came to a stop at the sword that Zenitsu still had gripped in his hand. Before Zenitsu could even react, his sword was snatched away from him, pale threads wrapped tightly around the sheath, bringing it over to the demon. He took the sword out of its sheath and tossed the sheath away to thick bushes on the side before looking down at the odd blade in his hands. The demon silently stared down at it, twisting it with his hands, as if he was fully inspecting it. Silently, the demon looked back up at Zenitsu and held the sword out. Only to snap the sword in half with his thread. Zenitsu could only watch as both pieces of his sword dropped to the ground, his body paralyzed in both shock and disbelief. Despite not wanting to have to do anything with the sword in the first place, the sword was still important to him. Sure, there were many times in which he threw the sword aside, and sure, he had considered that he never deserved the blade in the first place, but it was still precious. It was a sword that had been made purely for him. And seeing it, the blade split into two pieces, it made Zenitsu want to break down into tears and scream. The demon had taken something precious away from him and so easily while Zenitsu had done nothing to stop it. Now it's clear for you what you are, Rue remarked, his threads glistening under the pale moonlight. He took a step forward, his cruel eye still focused on Zenitsu. Starting today, you're part of my family. Zenitsu trembled under the overwhelming sound that made its way to his ears. Nothing about the sound that came from Rue's heart made him feel safe or welcomed. It was too contorted with hate and cruelty. And the way he spoke about his family was painstakingly clear, his idea of a family was about control and fear. He could see it with how he treated the female demon by him. The moment she said something that the demon took as disobedience, she cowered in pure fear, her sound beating rapidly at a frightening pace. It was not right. Even if Zenitsu didn't have a family he could call his own, he would not join this demon's fake family. Summoning all the courage he had left in his trembling form, Zenitsu forced himself to look up from his broken sword to the demon in front of him. Gritting his teeth, he dared to deny the demon despite knowing what it could mean for him. No. Immediately, Zenitsu was struck by a wave of aggravating pain, his head crouching forward to his hands to ease his injured face. He whimpered as his closed eyes made contact with his hands, feeling the warm but sticky blood seeping from them. Reluctantly, he tried to open his eyelids, but all he could see was pitch black, not being able to make out any other color. It didn't take too long for Zenitsu to figure out that he had been struck by Rue's threads in his eyes. Although his blindness was not permanent, the idea that he couldn't see anything was frightening enough. However, the fact that Zenitsu could hear was more than enough to keep Zenitsu slightly calm. He just needed to listen. Rue, Zenitsu heard the other female demon speak as she took a trembling step forward. Let's just leave him. He doesn't want to join willingly. Shouldn't we instead focus on the demon hunters here? More of them are arriving. The female demon paused, but then continued although with a tremor in her voice. Should we run away? Zenitsu flinched, hearing only the agonizing scream of pain that erupted from the female demon's mouth as she fell forward to her knees. He figured she had been struck by the other after her comment. He could hear her shoulders tremble with each breath she took, her muffled crying echoing throughout the small clearing they were in. Whatever Rue had done, he had done so ruthlessly with no visible sign of remorse from his beating heart. He truly didn't care about his so-called family. Slowly, Zenitsu removed his hands from his eyes and hesitantly looked up at the two demons. His vision was blurry and he could only make out splotches of color, but he could slightly see and it was more than enough. Blinking away the tears and blood, he shifted his gaze around, desperately trying to make out anywhere he could run to. This was his best chance to escape and find Tanjiro and the others. If he stayed there any longer, he was afraid of what Rue would do next. The overpowering sound from Rue's beating heart was proving to be too much for his weak self to listen to. After all, with every second, Rue was proving to be a demon he or anyone he cared about couldn't hope to kill. What are you looking at? This isn't a stage show. Zenitsu instantly went still, not having to look up to see who Rue had addressed. He knew the kind gentle heartbeat from anywhere. And yet, he cursed the fact that the person the heartbeat belonged to had to find him now of all times, especially when said heartbeat was beating with unbridled rage and fury. Zenitsu was truly terrified for Tanjiro. As with the case of Inosuke, he knew Tanjiro would charge in to protect him. But charging in would mean certain death for Tanjiro. The red-haired boy needed to stay back. He had no idea what Rue was capable of. He needed to turn and run away. Zenitsu would not let him die needlessly for him. Zenitsu! The other boy shouted, his voice filled with so much concern and fear for the other that it sickened Zenitsu. Are you okay? Zenitsu forced himself to nod his head in confirmation, only seeing blurred red and green colors stare back at him. There was no doubt in his mind that Tanjiro could see the injury on his face as well as his damaged clothing from his fight with the older spider demon. He could practically hear the sharp pang of regret from Tanjiro's own heart. It made Zenitsu want to run over to the kind boy and throw his arms around the other. He wanted to shake Tanjiro till he understood that what happened wasn't his fault. In a perfect world, that would be what Zenitsu would do, but here, he was simply too afraid to get up. Not when the horrible sound right next to him continued to ring, growing with irritation with each passing second. What are you doing? The red-haired boy growled, addressing the child demon standing by Zenitsu. How could you hurt Zenitsu and your own ally? Ally? Rue emotionlessly remarked. Our connection is nothing so superficial like that. We are family. Strong ties bind us. This matter is between me and my older siblings. If you interrupt me, I'll carve you up. Tanjiro narrowed his eyes, his teeth gritting in rage. Zenitsu is not yours to force to be in your family. He has a family of his own. Besides, whether you are family or friends, such strong connections are precious. Not being related by blood doesn't make a connection superficial. I can smell the trust between people with strong ties, but between you and the one you hurt, I only smell fear, hatred, and loathing. No, Tanjiro, stop. Don't say it. I wouldn't call that family ties. It's a sham. It's fake. Zenitsu stared at the blurred figure that was Tanjiro, paralyzed with shock and disbelief. Why did Tanjiro have to say that? Did he not read the situation? Yes, it was true that Roy's family was not bound by trust and instead twisted with fear and hatred, but that was not something to shout out to a ruthless killer. How could Tanjiro make such a mistake? Oh. Looks like I've found just the right kind of demon. Zenitsu whirled around, his eyes going wide as he could make out another demon hunter taking a step into the clearing they were in. The boy was clearly older than them, but he was too cocky and sure of himself, making the kind of grinding sound only those that were too short-sighted in their desires could make. The boy made a comment about slaying Roy to safely promote to a higher rank and recklessly charged forward, his sword aimed at the child demon. Zenitsu heard Tanjiro yell at the other to stop, but all he could do was watch. He gaped in silence at the older figure as the boy soon split into pieces with so much red splattering everywhere. Zenitsu hoped that maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him or that he simply hadn't gained back his vision, but the longer he stared at the pieces of flesh that used to be the boy in front of him, the more he realized that what he was seeing was real. Another heartbeat had been silenced. And he had done nothing to stop it. What did you just say? Zenitsu widened his eyes, terror coursing through his veins. Roy's heartbeat had become louder, so much anger and hatred ringing that it overpowered every other sound in the clearing they were, even blocking Tanjiro's own gentle sound. Zenitsu felt his hands shake, cold and clammy as dread settled in his hammering chest. Whatever Roy was going to do next, it was not going to bode well for either of them. The demon was livid with fury and would not hesitate to release that rage. What did you just say? Zenitsu dared to look up at Tanjiro, seeing the ever-present fear in his eyes. He could see his clenched hands tremble and the beads of sweat rolling down from his forehead, and yet the red-headed boy was unrelenting in his gaze. Zenitsu knew that no matter what Roy would do, Tanjiro would not change his answer. And that terrified him. I'll say it again, Tanjiro answered with no sign of regret in his unwavering voice. Your so-called family ties are fake. Zenitsu watched in disbelief as Tanjiro then charged forward, reacting instantly to the wire that shot out at him from Roy's hand. Tanjiro dodged gracefully under the wire, never stopping and only continuing his path forward. Two other wires blocked his path, crossing over in front of his stomach, and instinctively, Tanjiro held his sword over his head, ready to swing it to slice the wires in half. Zenitsu widened his eyes at Tanjiro's action and opened his mouth to warn the other, but it was too late. Like what had happened to Zenitsu's own blade, Tanjiro's sword was effortlessly sliced in half, broken into two pieces with only the handle clenched tightly in Tanjiro's hand. Tanjiro stared wide-eyed at the blade, his body paralyzed with shock, which was all Roy needed to finish his attack. Tanjiro, watch out! Zenitsu screamed. Somehow, Zenitsu's voice was able to shake Tanjiro back to his senses, at least enough for him to twist his body around the wire aimed at his stomach. Tanjiro crumbled to the ground with a gash to his cheek, wincing slightly at the small wound, but there was no time for him to recover from his shock. Roy continued his attack ruthlessly, sending wires at Tanjiro from every direction. Zenitsu could only watch helplessly as more cuts were added to Tanjiro's body, blood seeping from every wound. No matter where Tanjiro rolled around, another wire was there to meet him in his path. It soon began to dawn on Zenitsu that Roy was not aiming to kill Tanjiro outright as he had done to the older demon hunter. No, what Roy wanted to do was torture Tanjiro and make him suffer for what he said. And after Tanjiro had suffered enough, that was when Roy would end it. Just as Zenitsu feared, that was what exactly happened. A web of wires surrounded Tanjiro ready to slice him into pieces. Zenitsu knew that there was no way Tanjiro would be able to dodge the threads in time. Even Tanjiro had realized this undeniable fact. The boy was stuck, petrified with horror visible in his eyes at the oncoming threads. He had been caught in a deadly trap with no way of escape. Tanjiro was going to die. No. Without any second thought, Zenitsu got on his feet and rushed blindly at Roy, swinging what was left of his sword at the demon. Roy reacted instantly, dodging his clumsy excuse of an attack with an unfazed gaze. With a swing of his hand, the child demon sent him rolling back to the ground with his threads, trapping him in a web of them that circled around his legs and arms, digging into his skin keeping him immobilized. Zenitsu could not help but let out a shrill cry of pain as the threads dug deeper and deeper, drawing out blood. In between the torrent of raw searing pain, he could make out a voice calling him with desperation and horror in its pitch, but he could not respond. You protected him. Roy's voice suddenly rang out, oddly with surprise in his voice. And just as quick as the threads wrapped around Zenitsu's boy, they became still, no longer piercing into his skin. Zenitsu allowed himself to blink in confusion, eyes slowly going wide. Footsteps echoed from his right and he looked up to see Roy towering over him, his low knife staring coldly back. You are a demon and yet you protected him by getting in my way. Why? Zenitsu gritted his teeth despite the rush of fear and panic that gnawed at his insides. A demon that could easily make him suffer was asking him a question why he would protect his friend. How was he supposed to answer that? The wrong answer could mean the child demon inflicting his wrath on him, but there was no way in hell he was going to let Tanjiro die. I don't care that I'm a demon. Zenitsu finally spoke, his voice surprisingly clear with no tremor in it. I won't let my friend die in front of me. Roy narrowed his eye, but slowly a slight grin formed from his scowl. His eye grew with amusement as if he just found a new toy that caught his eye. And judging from the unbearable sound that quickened in pitch from Roy's heartbeat, he was not going to let go of this new toy anytime soon. I see now. You are together with this human despite the fact that he is a demon hunter and you are a demon. You even go far to protect him against me. I see. That is the type of bond one want. Wait, what? That was not the response Zenitsu expected. Before he could even respond, Roy raised his hands and Zenitsu felt the threads wrapped around him tightened yet again. He let out a sharp cry of pain, eyes squeezing shut with tears quickly forming in the corner of his eyes. But even against all the pain, a soft chime of bells could be heard in the distance, screaming his name. Zenitsu. Zenitsu snapped his eyes open watching in shock as Tanjiro rushed towards him recklessly, his broken sword clenched tightly in his hand. Roy immediately sent his threads at Tanjiro to stop him, but Tanjiro continued his charge straight forward, even sacrificing his body in the process. The threads Tanjiro could have dodged easily left large gashes on his body. Still, that did not deter Tanjiro. He continued onward, getting closer with every passing second. Roy's heartbeat roared with aggravation and the child demon raised his hands, having enough of Tanjiro. The child demon sent a wave of threads at Tanjiro, encasing the boy again in a web of them ready to dice him into pieces. Despite the immediate danger Tanjiro had placed himself in, the red-headed boy's eyes were still solely focused on Zenitsu's own pair. There was fear present in those red eyes, but Zenitsu soon realized that it was not for his safety Tanjiro was afraid of, but for Zenitsu's own. And that completely broke Zenitsu. Tanjiro! The yellow-haired boy screamed, his voice raw with horror and despair feeling nothing but helplessness at the sight of the pale threads inching closer to Tanjiro's body. Zenitsu yanked his body upward in an effort to free himself from the threads wrapped around him, but they would not snap. All he managed to do was make the threads sink deeper into his skin. Realizing it was futile to escape, Zenitsu dared to look back up at Tanjiro, his tearful eyes gazing at the scene in pure terror. The threads were closer now, and soon there would only be a mess of blood and flesh to be left behind. Suddenly, a torrent of an angry tsunami thrashed from behind Tanjiro. A shadow appeared over the red-haired boy and arms spread wide. Nezuko stood in front of Tanjiro taking Rue's ruthless attack instead. Nezuko! Tanjiro screamed, his voice filled with horror and deep aching sadness. Instinctively, the older brother grabbed his injured sister and pulled her behind a tree into bushes. Zenitsu could hear the loud pang of regret that resounded from Tanjiro's kind heart, as the older boy tried to help Nezuko. There was no doubt in Zenitsu's mind that Nezuko was not healing enough to help with her wounds. From what he could remember, she had never been injured to the point her limbs could fall off. Zenitsu desperately wanted to run over to the two and wrap them in his arms. So much guilt and sadness pierced its way to his heart. It had been his fault that both Tanjiro and Nezuko had been hurt. He had been useless. Like always. He couldn't protect the two siblings. You are brother and sister? Rue suddenly asked, with a slight tremor in his voice. This comment tore Zenitsu away from his thoughts, his eyebrows furrowing in confusion. Something new was taking shape in Rue's head, a new unwanted fixation on the two siblings. Siblings. Rue muttered to himself in thought, not even caring that he was speaking out loud. His sister is a demon, but he is still with her just like this one. His sister even protected him by leaping in the way. Ah, Rue. The female demon nearby spoke. That is it. Theirs is a true familial bond. That's what I want. W8. The female demon shouted, her voice filled with renewed terror. These two demons can't be your family. I'm your older sister. Haven't I proven myself already? Don't abandon me. Shut up. Zenitsu flinched and snapped his eyes shut, not being able to handle what Rue did to his so-called sister. The sound of a head falling to the ground was more than enough for Zenitsu to visualize what Rue heartlessly did. With a few hurtful, callous words, the child demon sent the other demon away, turning back to look at where Tanjiro and Nezuko had disappeared to with an uncomfortable eerily silence. Boy, let's talk. Rue raised his hand to his chest. I was moved when I saw the connection you have between these two. It made me shiver. I'm sure there are no words to express what you three have, but I have to kill you. However, there is a way to avoid that. Rue paused and raised his finger, his voice never unwavering in emotion despite the sympathy he said he had for Tanjiro. Give me your sister and I will keep the one I already have. If you leave them here quietly, I will spare your life. I don't understand, Tanjiro responded behind the bush he took cover in. As of now, I want both your sister and your friend to be my siblings. Anger immediately vibrated from Tanjiro's heartbeat. There's no way I can accept that. Nezuko and Zenitsu are not things. They both have feelings and their own will. It's alright. I will forge a bond with them. I'm stronger. It will start as a bond of fear. They'll know what will happen if they disobey me. Are you insane? Tanjiro spat, frustration and fury pounding loudly for all to hear. Using fear to bond with someone is not a familial tie. It's not how you connect to someone. As long as you think that, you'll never get what you want. You're so loud, Rue replied, his visible eye slowly narrowing in annoyance. I don't like you. Footsteps echoed and Zenitsu raised his eyes in alarm, watching as Tanjiro walked away from where he had taken Nezuko to, eyes locked onto Rue with fury blazing in his dark red pupils. He raised his broken sword at Rue, no hesitance in his stance. I'll never give Nezuko and Zenitsu to you. Of course you won't, so I'll kill you and take them myself. After all, Rui parted his hair away from his covered eye, allowing the eye to finally be seen for all who dared to look at it. Carved into the eye was a sickly dark red number 5, signifying what the child demon was. You don't have what it takes to defeat one of the 12 Kazuki. Crimson red. It was a color that Zenitsu was beginning to grow tired of seeing. So much of it oozed down the thin pale wires that entangled its prey from high above. The crimson liquid stained the wires, sliding down to the ground below, landing onto the dark vegetation with a deafening sound. A sound that continued to haunt Zenitsu's ears with each passing second. Nezuko. Zenitsu vaguely heard Tanjiro screaming in the distance. His voice was wrapped in pure horror, obviously at the sight of his beloved captured sister. Cease your screeching. My threads won't kill her. She's a demon. Rui carelessly remarked close by. But she must learn her role. If she won't obey me, I'll leave her like that until sunrise and let her get scorched a bit. Scorch Nezuko with sunlight? No, not that. He couldn't. Not to Nezuko, the one who had accepted him so quickly only after being introduced to him by Tanjiro, the one who continued to understand how he felt, who knew the struggles of being a demon, and the one who even risked being burnt by the sun just to listen to him complaining. No, Rui couldn't do that to such a kind girl, a kind sister that would go through such lengths just to protect those dear to her. No. Zenitsu yelled, his head whipping away from Nezuko at Rui. He clenched his jaw and yanked his body upward, ignoring the burning sensation his abrupt movement caused to his body. He couldn't care less as the thread sunk deeper into his body. He had to escape and save Nezuko and Tanjiro. He couldn't let them get hurt. Shut up. He heard Rui say, irritation flaring from his voice. A wave of searing pain lashed at Zenitsu's outstretched wrist, twisting itself around it and tightening, digging into Zenitsu's bone. Zenitsu could not hold in his longing to scream nor stop the torrent of tears that escaped down his cheeks. The thin thread that had seized his wrist tightened and tightened until finally, all Zenitsu could hear was a loud popping sound. The pain immediately subsided, but Zenitsu was left feeling disoriented and nauseated. His head pounded as a chilling warmth swept through his body. Zenitsu tried to make sense of the surging warmth, but he was too absorbed by the buzzing in his ears to make any coherent thought. Instinctively, he tried to move his hand, but nothing moved. He realized he couldn't feel it. Finally, Zenitsu looked down. What he saw sent him reeling back in shock. Detached from his hand laying in a large pool of dark crimson blood was his hand still grasping his broken sword. Zenitsu gasped, but no air went in. His remaining hand shook without his control as his heart thudded loudly in his chest. He wanted to release the contents of his stomach, but his throat was so dry that it was hard to even swallow. Too quickly, his vision began to grow blurry with black spots consuming his sight. Zenitsu fought to stay awake. He really tried, but there was no strength left to give. As Zenitsu succumbed to the comfort of the darkness a second time for the day, one thought managed to echo in his pounding head, leaving nothing but guilt to pierce his aching heart. I'm sorry. Strum. Zenitsu snapped his eyelids open, his eyes quickly coming to a stop in the direction where the sound echoed from. It was pitch black around him, suffocating him in a deep void of emptiness, but he could hear it, an instrument being played not too far. The instrument seemed old, and slightly out of tune, as if the sound came from an instrument that was barely usable, but the melody that was being played from it was familiar to Zenitsu. Almost too familiar. Slowly, Zenitsu took a step forward, his feet carrying him to where the song was calling out for him. He walked in silence with only the sound of the song ahead of him to listen to. Zenitsu had no idea how long he walked nor how far he went, but once he found his destination, a wave of lethargicness washed over him. He could feel his eyelids and feet becoming heavy as his surroundings became much too hazy. He realized he couldn't concentrate on anything except what was in front of him. It was all his drowsy mind could focus on. In front of him sat a seated shadowy figure playing an instrument, their face shrouded in black that made it impossible to make out their facial features. The one thing Zenitsu could see was how they played the instrument in their hands. They strummed the instrument delicately with long slender fingers, never making any mistakes as they hummed to a distinct but appealing melody. There was something about the vibrations from the instrument that felt so heavenly to Zenitsu, as if it were a warm summer embrace that could wrap tightly around his arms and chase all his fears and worries away. Soon, Zenitsu found he couldn't stop the tears from flowing from his droopy eyes. The song, No Lullaby, was calling for him, and it was telling him to go to sleep. So Zenitsu moved forward, his head nodding off with each step. His body swayed to the flowing rhythm of the lullaby, getting closer with each step to the figure as they continued to play the instrument in their hands. The song paused and Zenitsu blinked in a daze, seeing the shadowy figure now holding their hand out for him to take, offering all the unconditional love he could hear from their sweet mesmerizing lullaby. Yes, that was right, he just needed to let everything go. ZT. Zenitsu paused, his hazy mind managing to grasp onto one thought. He was forgetting something. What was it that he was letting go? He couldn't remember what he was, but it was important, right? But why couldn't he remember? Zenitsu. That voice. He knew the voice, but who was it? It had to be someone important to him. The voice had a sense of comfort and tranquility to it, sending so much warmth to Zenitsu's aching chest. He knew the voice, but from where? He couldn't see the face it belonged to. The thought was there, but it couldn't be grasped no matter how much Zenitsu tried to reach for it. Strum. Zenitsu blinked, his sight focused on the shadowy figure in front of him once more. That's right, it didn't matter who was calling him. The figure in front of him was so close to touching now. They, too, were familiar. His heart ached to see at least any feature on their face to recognize who they were. To his surprise, the sweet lullaby whispered to his ears that if he allowed the figure to pull him to sleep, he would have his answer. Just one more step. Zenitsu. Zenitsu flinched, his eyelids flickering open, his mind snapping from the drowsiness that had him in its tight hold. He looked back to where the gentle voice had called from, his golden eyes widening in realization. Tanjiro. He whispered. That's right. What was he thinking? Tanjiro and Nezuko were in danger and they needed him. He couldn't fall asleep at a time like this, not when the two siblings needed his help. He had to protect them just as they have done for him. To think he was letting a simple children's lullaby pull him to sleep when Tanjiro's voice had been calling him all along. How could he have done such a thing? Zenitsu gritted his teeth and turned back to the shadowy figure with frustration, but he was unprepared for what he saw. The shadowy figure now stood in front of him, their hands so close to his cheek. It was small and petite, the fingernails slightly grazing his cheek, but never drawing any blood. And he could smell something from the figure. Sweetness? Yes, it definitely smelled sweet, but mild in that it didn't overpower his nose. However, his ears couldn't pick a single sound from the figure's heartbeat. There was only silence to listen to. No, wait, that wasn't right. There was a sound he could detect from the shadowy figure's heartbeat. A rich, percussive sound wrapped with a distinctive buzz that spoke of deep fondness for him. He didn't understand what it meant. The figure was unrecognizable to him and yet they seemed to know him well enough. Zenitsu wanted to question the figure, impatience and anger bubbling from his chest, but before he could even get one word out, the figure strummed the instrument in their hands and vanished, leaving only a gentle wind to brush against Zenitsu's skin. Zenitsu blinked, confused and alone, but the warm light that began to shine from up above him drove all his concerns away for the moment. He was no longer wrapped in an empty dark void devoid of any sound. He was back with a familiar sight and now he had to save his friends. Closing his eyes and finally relying on his ears, Zenitsu was met with a familiar dark forest, ringing with so many sounds from the vegetation around. He slightly shifted his hearing away from the plants to where the most noise was coming from, finding Tanjiro charging forward at Rui with his broken sword clenched tightly in his shaky hand. Rui, without making much change to his heartbeat, reacted nonchalantly to Tanjiro's attack. He raised his hands that were drenched in a dripping substance and his threads moved slightly in response. Multiple cobwebs suddenly appeared in front of Tanjiro, encasing him in Rui's deadly trap. Horror and fear rang from Tanjiro's heart and Zenitsu gasped in response. His friend was mere seconds from an unavoidable death and all he could do was listen to his heartbeat. At that moment all Zenitsu could think about was the people he had met thanks to Tanjiro. He saw Nezuko, quiet but all so appealing, offering him a blanket as she listened to his concerns for the future, never complaining about his ugly crying. He saw Inosuke, so prideful and loud, swinging his sword forward for him and Tanjiro to follow behind, but never doing a good job to hide the sudden sense of companionship he found in who he now traveled with. He saw Tamayo, sorrowful eyes full of kindness, as she gently pushed him to her chest as he sobbed uncontrollably and Yashiro, eyes looking at him with disdain, but still willing to help him and Tanjiro for Tamayo's sake. He saw Chuntaro, a loyal and caring sparrow pecking at his scalp to take care of himself while making sure he never strayed from the wrong direction in front of him. And he saw Tanjiro, a kind-hearted boy offering him a warm callous hand, leading him outside to a world from a cold damp house back to a life he never thought was possible for him to continue to pursue. Tanjiro, the one who had helped take a step to a world that did not need him nor care for his condition, was going to die. No. Heat surged from Zenitsu's chest, traveling to his neck and face to the tip of his head where a searing pain exploded with a blinding whiteness. Zenitsu grimaced, his body unable to deal with the crushing weight on his skull. The pain was so intense, so all-consuming, that it felt like Zenitsu was getting struck by lightning again. It made him reel. It felt like needles were being jammed into his skull, tearing him open as something protruded from under the skin. Just as quickly as the pain ramped up, the agony faded to a dull throb, but Zenitsu realized he could hear a low rumble begin to build up in sound from above. Something hot was crackling around him, pricking his skin as it danced around him. He realized he could no longer hear Tanjiro or Rui or anything else around him. All his ears could hear was the buzzing sound piercing the air. It was strikingly loud. His head pounded with each beat and blinding whiteness overtook every thought he could make. Except for one. Demon blood technique, scarlet lightning, Zenitsu muttered incoherently. And thunder roared in response. Everything burned. Tanjiro's limbs felt so heavy, weighted with exhaustion and soreness. He struggled to keep his focus on the demon before him, his mind wanting to fall to the comfort of sleep creeping up from behind him. Despite his spotty vision, the pounding of his beating heart kept him gripping his sword. He continued to move forward with every glide of his blade. He couldn't stop now. Not when Nezuko and Zenitsu needed him to protect them. If he stopped now, he'll suffer the recoil from forcibly changing water breathing to the dance of the fire god. And then there would be no way of stopping Rui from getting what he wanted. No, he would not let that happen. Eyes narrowing, Tanjiro slashed through the threads in front of him and brought his sword straight for Rui's neck. He saw the threads that quickly surrounded him in response. They were now in front of him at his neck and face. But Tanjiro only gritted his teeth as his sword continued to swing forward at its target. If the only way to cut Rui's neck was to get sliced into pieces from the threads, then that was what he was going to do. Whatever it took, he would follow his strike. For Nezuko and Zenitsu's sake, he would protect them. Boom. Tanjiro widened his eyes as something yellow flashed through his vision followed by surging red that ignited the threads around him, easily snapping them in half. He felt the warm fire lightly caress his skin as angular shapes of yellow bolts buzzed and hissed around him, but never touching him. As the fiery heat enveloped Tanjiro's broken sword, the bolts of lightning around Tanjiro headed straight for Rui, striking him with a booming clap of thunder. Wreaths of steam rose from Rui's burning body with crude jagged scarlet marks moving across his pale skin, scarring him. Tanjiro didn't know what had burned the threads or where the lightning came from, but they had saved him. They were proof that he could not die yet. With that thought, Tanjiro finally connected his sword with Roy's neck. The neck was hard and tough, but Tanjiro persisted. And gradually, the sword broke through the iron neck. With one final push, he slashed through the neck in one clean cut, screaming as loud as he could to Roy's now headless body. Nobody can ever break the bonds I have with Nezuko and Zenitsu. Tanjiro immediately fell to the ground on his stomach breathless, his lungs heaving for air. His limbs trembled and he could barely keep his grip on his sword. His vision was spotty, but he could make out Roy's headless body before him. The smell of thick blood was slowly disappearing from the area, so he had succeeded. Roy's head was nearby and anger was pulsating from his scent. Roy was talking incoherently. It was hard to understand what Roy was saying with the buzzing in Tanjiro's ears, but he was eventually able to make out what the pale demon was saying. How? How did it not work? That stupid boy. I'll kill him. And the girl. I'll make them both pay. Tanjiro blinked drowsily and glanced around, seeing Nezuko wrapped in Zenitsu's chest not too far away from him, both on the ground unconscious. Tanjiro felt the salty tears slide down his cheeks at the sight of both of them safe. He crawled towards them, grunting and heaving in pain with each movement he made. His body felt so heavy that he had to dig his nails into the dirt just to lift himself forward. It was painfully agonizing. His body screamed at him to stop, to just rest and go to sleep, but he ignored the strong longing. He willed his weakened body to keep moving and endure. It was all he could do. Once he was close enough, he took both Zenitsu and Nezuko's warm hands into his own, trembling as he tried not to squeeze their hands too hard. He choked at the relief he felt at the sight of their sleeping forms. Nezuko and Zenitsu were both safe. They all were. I hate you. Tanjiro flinched and turned back, seeing Roy's headless fading body standing over him. It collapsed, its hands close to his shoulder. Tanjiro widened his eyes, his nose twitching at the unbearable scent of sadness coming from the body. It was heavy, weighing him down with its melancholic scent. Grimacing, Tanjiro placed his other hand on Roy's back, gently rubbing it. Immediately, he was overtaken by the smell of remorse. Tanjiro was struck with sympathy for the demon, no child. The child took the wrong path, but in the end, he regretted what he did. So, Tanjiro offered a silent prayer for the dying child. Once Roy had completely faded away, Tanjiro turned back to his sister and Zenitsu, his eyes scanning the pair for any injuries. Roy's threads had cut them excessively, but it seemed they both were physically okay. However, Zenitsu now had two tiny horns on each side of his head. He stared at the horns questionably, wondering where they had come from and why they were there. Zenitsu still had the familiar scent of peaches that belonged to him, so they didn't change anything in regard to his inner self, but they still made him worried for his friend. Tanjiro, said a rough voice, thick with sleep. Tanjiro blinked, shaken out of his thoughts as he caught Zenitsu beginning to stir. The yellow-haired groaned and turned to him, scrunching his eyes at the bright light that slipped through his closed eyelids. Zenitsu! Tanjiro yelled, his body moving closer to Zenitsu in concern without thinking. Are you okay? Zenitsu nodded shakily, but his face contorted in pain. He finally opened his eyelids, his golden eyes falling onto Tanjiro with such intensity that it made Tanjiro stiffen in surprise. What about you, idiot? You're the one that was fighting Roy. The older boy pointed out hoarsely. He coughed and turned his sight at the younger girl that was still on him. Is Nezuko-chan okay? I think so. Thank you for catching her, Tanjiro said, his lips smiling in gratitude before quickly remembering why they were in this situation. He frowned and bowed his head forward to the ground apologetically to his friend. Zenitsu, I'm so sorry. I allowed Roy to catch you and Nezuko when I should have been protecting you too. Honestly, you're an idiot. A hard-headed idiot that cannot stop being so reckless. Zenitsu replied completely breathless. Zenitsu pulled himself up from the ground and carefully handed Nezuko to Tanjiro's chest while glaring at the red-headed boy with heated anger in his golden eyes. Tanjiro noted that the smell of anger wasn't that of hate or fury but that of deep concern and worry. You cannot possibly think that this was your fault. If anything, I'm the one who should be apologizing. I know I said I wanted you to protect me, but... Zenitsu shook his head angrily and looked back at Tanjiro with narrowed eyes. You need to protect yourself too, Tanjiro. Stop charging in without thinking. At least for Nezuko's sake, think about yourself as well. What would she do if you died while trying to save her? Who would she have to help cure her then? Zenitsu. Tanjiro hesitantly argued. I know, Zenitsu interrupted. It's who you are, but at least take yourself into consideration next time. Please. He groaned and placed his hand on his forehead, eyebrows furrowing in a grimace. Immediately, Tanjiro moved closer to his friend and placed his hand on his shoulder to comfort him. Zenitsu was trying to hide it, but Tanjiro could see how exhausted he was. Zenitsu's breathing was shallow and the boy felt perhaps too warm for Tanjiro's liking. It seemed Zenitsu was making every effort to hide his health but Tanjiro could see. He wondered what the cause could be though. Where's Chuntaro? Tanjiro decided to ask. You need to let yourself heal. Zenitsu shifted his body away from Tanjiro's hand with an icy glare. There's no way I'm doing that when you're hurt. Zenitsu shook his head stubbornly. No, let's just find Inosuke and get out of here. Who knows how injured he is without us to keep him in check. Zenitsu was right. They did need to find Inosuke. Tanjiro had been pushed away from Inosuke's side in the middle of a fight against a tough opponent. He had screamed for Inosuke to not die until he returned to help him. Inosuke was strong, but there was no way Inosuke could face a demon like that on his own without their help. He was terrified of the idea that Inosuke had been killed and eaten already. You're right. We have to go help Inosuke. Tanjiro exclaimed, his voice raw with panic. We got separated in the middle of a fight with a demon. Zenitsu widened his eyes in shock but nodded. Fine, I'll carry Nezuko-chan. You need to dash. Zenitsu froze and right away his body began to tremble. Confused, Tanjiro reached for his friend in concern when his nose suddenly twitched at a new scent not too far from them. It was a familiar scent, a clear herbal fragrance that reminded him of a gentle calm body of water untouched by the breeze. He realized that the familiar scent was that of one that he had not sensed in a long time. The person the scent belonged to was running towards them, with a clear conviction in each step they took. Instinctively, Tanjiro sprung into action. Zenitsu! The red-headed boy cried, grabbing onto Zenitsu and pushing him to the ground just as a gust of wind blew at the spot Zenitsu's head had been at. Shakily, Tanjiro looked up, seeing none other than Ju Tomioka staring down at him with his stoic dark blue eyes. His sword was outstretched above Tanjiro's head. Tanjiro felt his heart thump loudly against his chest at the sight of the sharp blue blade. If he had been a second late, Zenitsu would have been surely killed. Why are you on that demon? Ju asked tonelessly, though there was no sign of recognition in his eyes. Did the dark-haired demon hunter not recognize him? Tanjiro shook his head. Still, this was his chance. While Ju was a demon hunter, he had spared Nezuko that fateful day 2 years ago and had helped Tanjiro by sending him to find his MSTR. Ju had become someone he could trust. Perhaps, if he explained everything, Ju would do the same for Zenitsu and spare him. He had to. Tomioka-san. Tanjiro shouted, hoping that the man would at least recognize his voice. Zenitsu is like Nezuko. He hasn't eaten another person. He's not a monster. You can't kill him. Nezuko? The man questioned. He turned his gaze to Nezuko, who was still deep in sleep by Tanjiro's side. The man stared at the girl, studying her face for a few seconds in silence before turning back to Tanjiro. And slowly but surely, Tanjiro saw Ju widened his eyes in recognition. Ju finally understood who he was. You're. From behind Ju, a new scent caught Tanjiro's nose, and unlike Ju's scent, this one carried ill intent for his sister and friend. Tanjiro barely had time to pull Nezuko and Zenitsu to his chest and lean over them as he felt the wind caused by a swipe of a blade upon him. But then he heard it. A loud clang as the blade was deflected. Ju had protected them. "Oh, why are you getting in my way, Tomioka-san?" Tanjiro watched as a woman with shoulder-length dark hair and a pale complexion gracefully landed on the ground from the sky, skidding to a stop with a smile that looked forced. Her blank purple eyes gazed forward. As Ju turned forward from where he had crouched down, placing himself in front of Tanjiro and his demon companions with his sword hanging protectively in front of them. "You said we can't get along with demons, but here I see you protecting two of them. If you do this, everyone will hate you, you see." "I am not hated," Ju bluntly replied. The woman widened her eyes and lowered her sword, her lips slightly frowning apologetically. I'm so sorry, but you didn't realize." "Pardon me for saying that much." The woman turned her gaze from Ju to Tanjiro, calling him out much to Tanjiro's surprise. "Boy, you're protecting two demons. It's dangerous, so please get off of them." I mean, you're not wrong, but this is my little sister and friend. That's why Oh. The woman said, interrupting Tanjiro's sloppy explanation. She covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes looking over at him with sympathy. "Is that so? What a pity. Okay then." She lifted her sword up to her face, her lips curving upward dangerously that it sent fear trickling down Tanjiro's spine. "I'll kill both of them with a sweet poison that won't leave them in pain." Terror stabbed Tanjiro's heart at what the woman remarked back to him. He had protected his sister and friend for so long just to find a cure for them, and yet, here was a woman that did not care about his familial ties to them. Although she said she would kill them with a gentle poison, Tanjiro could not stand it. Dread twisted in his stomach and Tanjiro was overcome with the feeling that he might throw up. How could this woman say such a thing? "Can you move?" Ju suddenly asked, silencing the beating terror in Tanjiro's chest momentarily. "Even if you can't will yourself. Take your sister and friend and run." Tanjiro widened his eyes in shock. Ju still was willing to help him. Would he get in trouble for going against the woman, his comrade, in front of them? No, why was Ju making such a decision that would ultimately affect his position as a demon slayer? "Tomioka-san." Tanjiro murmured, beyond astonished. He shook his head and looked down at Nezuko and Zenitsu. Nezuko was still asleep, but Zenitsu was silent, holding his gaze on the pale woman before them. His face was ashen and his golden eyes were wide with panic. But what frightened Tanjiro the most was that his friend had a scent of acceptance around him. Zenitsu was actually accepting the idea that the woman might kill him. At that realization, Tanjiro did the only thing he could do. Gritting his teeth, he pushed himself up from the ground and took Nezuko in one arm, bringing her to his chest, and pulled Zenitsu up with his other hand. With all the strength he had left, he willed himself to run away, taking his sister and friend away from the woman that wanted to kill them. "I'm sorry. Thank you so much." Tanjiro stumbled with each step he took, but he never stopped moving. Even when his body screamed at him to stop, Tanjiro continued forward. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, his mind would not stop replaying the words the woman had told him. He knew she had been kind by offering to kill Nezuko and Zenitsu in a painless way, but it still hurt. They were precious to him. Nezuko was his only family. His whole family had been taken away and Nezuko was all he had left. And Zenitsu was a friend that he cared too much for. They both gave him something to fight for. The pale woman couldn't take the two away. If she did, he didn't know if living would be worth it then. Do I have to pull out of the demon hunters? Tanjiro asked himself, lungs heaving in an effort to catch a breath. No, that's okay. No matter how human Nezuko and Zenitsu appear to be, they won't accept them. Even if I'm no longer part of the association, I'll still find a cure for them. Tamayo-san will help. I'm sure of it. In the meantime, I just have to protect them. Tanjiro. Tanjiro widened his eyes as he felt a sudden weight pushing him forward, sending him and Nezuko crashing to the ground. He blinked, dazed, seeing Zenitsu kneeling by him, panic flaring in his eyes at the sight of a dark-haired girl standing in front of them with blank eyes. How? Tanjiro thought with horror tightening in his chest. I ran with all I could. The unknown girl didn't give Tanjiro a chance to respond. She dashed forward, stopping in front of Zenitsu with her sword raised to the air ready to chop off the yellow-haired boy's bare neck. Tanjiro widened his eyes in horror and reacted the only way he could. He launched himself at the girl and clung onto her waist, sending the two of them backward away from Zenitsu. Waves of agonizing pain shot from Tanjiro's limbs at the force of the fall, but he only gritted his teeth and turned back to his sister and Zenitsu, the pair looking back at him with wide eyes. Run Nezuko. Run Zenitsu. Run dash. Tanjiro was interrupted by a searing pain crashing down on the back of his head that sent his face slamming to the ground. There was nothing he could do to fend off the darkness that abruptly took him in its hold. It was over for him. Tanjiro. The petrified yellow-haired boy by Nezuko screamed with horror in his voice. Nezuko could only look at the red-haired boy in silence, her eyes slowly widening at the scene before her. The boy had been slammed to the ground by the unnerving girl, his chin slamming against the hard surface with such an impact that it sent the boy into complete unconsciousness. She wanted to save the red-haired boy, the one that made her chest squeeze with emotions she couldn't explain why she had, but he had shouted at her and the yellow-haired boy to run. She understood why though. No matter how much she wanted to protect him, she knew that she couldn't disobey him. Not when the girl in front of her had that blade in her hands aimed at her and the yellow-haired boy by her. She knew that she had to listen to the boy with kind eyes and protect the golden-eyed boy from harm. With a huff, Nezuko took the yellow-haired boy's hand into hers and pulled him away, beginning to take him away from the girl with blank pink lilac eyes. She could feel the yellow-haired boy try to pull his hand away from her, but her grip wouldn't budge. Nezuko would not let the yellow-haired boy run back, not when the red-haired boy told them to run. Nezuko-chan. The yellow-haired boy screamed from behind. Nezuko turned back, her eyes catching the sight of a sword coming dangerously close to her neck. Quickly, she pulled Zenitsu to her chest and shrunk her body, managing to miss the sword as it swiped at the air above her. She continued to run forward with the screaming boy held tightly in her petite hands, dodging each swipe of the sword the pink lilac girl lunged at her. She was careful to not let the sword touch her and the yellow-haired boy in her arms. Even if she could stop the pink lilac-eyed girl, she would not fight the girl. The boy with red hair would be hurt if she did that. No, she would continue to run away and protect the yellow-haired boy in her hands. That was what she must do. Caw. Caw. A message. Message. We have a message. A voice suddenly rang out from above. Nezuko stopped as the girl with the sword paused as well. Nezuko looked above, finding a blackbird flapping its wings as it continued to speak. Restrain the ones named Tanjiro, Nezuko, and Zenitsu and bring them to headquarters. Tanjiro has a scar on his forehead. The demon Nezuko is biting onto a piece of bamboo and the demon Zenitsu has yellow hair. Restrain them and bring them to headquarters. Caw caw. Are you Nezuko and Zenitsu? The pink lilac-eyed girl asked, her face turning away from the crow to the pair of demons. She leaned forward to Nezuko, studying her and the yellow-haired boy she still had in her arms. Nezuko only stared back silently. She didn't understand what the blackbird meant, but it seemed that the pink lilac girl no longer wanted to hurt her and the boy she was carrying. She glanced down at the boy, watching as his body trembled with fear. She blinked and placed her hand on his soft hair, rubbing it gently. The boy froze, but Nezuko never let him go. She didn't understand what was happening, but she did know that she was not going to let any harm come to the yellow-haired boy she had in her arms. She would continue to protect him and the red-haired boy always. Zenitsu was tired. Too many thoughts raced in his aching head that it was hard for him to even keep a coherent thought. He knew he needed to stay calm, to stay reasonable, but his breathing was much too bred to even try maintaining deep breaths. His hands felt too clammy and it felt like his thumping heart might burst at any second now from his chest. There was no stopping the panic building up from within at the knowledge that he along with the Kamadu siblings were being taken to the Demon Slayer's headquarters not knowing what their fate may be. No, wait, that wasn't right. He knew what would happen to him and Nezuko, but Zenitsu was too afraid of what would happen to Tanjiro as well. Tanjiro had broken so many of the Demon Slayer Association's rules. He would indeed be punished severely for that. After the crow had alerted every demon hunter that Zenitsu and the Kamadu siblings were to be taken into headquarters unharmed, Zenitsu was quickly separated from Nezuko by two guys completely covered in black clothing that concealed their identities. If he remembered correctly from Gramps' teachings, they were called Kikushi. They were terrified to get close to him, something that Zenitsu didn't even have to use his hearing to identify. Their widened eyes and trembling shoulders were just enough for him to see how deathly afraid they were of his appearance. Zenitsu wanted to reaffirm to the two that he couldn't possibly think of bringing harm to them, but all he could do was stay silent and still, opting to listen instead. He knew that bursting into tears would probably only frighten the unfortunate pair. They didn't trust him like Tanjiro had upon their initial meeting. Complying to the pair, Zenitsu was blindfolded with a black cloth, and something rough was wrapped tightly around his wrists. Listening to their shaky commands, Zenitsu was quickly pulled away to an unknown destination. Although he couldn't see where he was being taken to, Zenitsu's ears helped him visualize what was around him. It seemed he was being guided through a thick forest. He wasn't completely blind to the world around him, which helped him feel slightly at ease. His no-good ears were useful in that regard at least. It seemed like a few hours passed before Zenitsu could identify that he was being led to a building creaking with many sounds from within its walls. Birds were chirping nearby and the sounds of insects stirring confirmed to him that the sun was rising soon. At least the pair leading him had pulled him into the building in time before he could be killed by the sun. Although, there were 9 heartbeats not too far away from him, 2 of which he recognized belonged to the man that had helped Tanjiro and the angry purple-eyed woman. They were strong and the 7 others by them were no different. Zenitsu was prettified by the idea of coming face to face with them. Steps echoed and a door creaked open with Zenitsu being pulled inside what he believed was a room. He stood motionlessly, listening as the pair of guys that had taken responsibility for him walked away from him back to what he believed was the entrance. With a click, the door was pulled shut, but Zenitsu heard their shallow breathing and murmurs from outside the door. He knew they were there to keep him from escaping. Fighting the unmistakable welling sadness bubbling from his chest, Zenitsu collapsed to his knees. He rubbed his fingers anxiously together, trying desperately to maintain his composure. Breathe, Zenitsu told himself. He was okay. They had not killed him yet. They could have left him out to the sun to die, so it meant that they wanted him alive for now. And if he was alive, then that meant Nezuko was alive as well, which also meant Tanjiro had to be okay. They wouldn't hurt him at least until they got his side of the story. Zenitsu felt lightheaded, and the thumping of his heart turned more insistent, but he continued to try to stay calm. He was scared that he would die, but even more so for his 2 friends. He didn't want Tanjiro and Nezuko to die, not when the 2 didn't deserve such a thing to happen to them. The 2 siblings had already suffered enough. Their entire family had been killed by a monster in a bloody massacre, leaving only Tanjiro and Nezuko behind to overcome the tragedy and Nezuko's unfortunate transformation into a demon. The Hashira had to see that. Tanjiro and Nezuko didn't deserve to die. But what if they didn't want to listen to Tanjiro? What if they ultimately decide he was guilty and kill him as well? Would they even show him sympathy and compassion for what happened to Nezuko? Would they even spare him for something he had no way of controlling? Breathe. Zenitsu pleaded to himself. But with each breath he took, he was finding it harder to inhale. And what about Inosuke? Would they kill the pig-headed boy as well for disobeying the rules? Initially, Inosuke was going to kill him and Nezuko, but upon Tanjiro's insistence, the rowdy boy backed away and now even viewed him and Nezuko as comrades. Would they punish Inosuke for this? Breathe. Zenitsu didn't want to die, but he didn't want his friends to die either. He didn't want anyone to die for that matter. It was too cruel, too heartless, too heartbreaking. He wanted them all to live. He wanted them all to continue living in the hellish world they found themselves in. Even himself. A gnawing numbness erupted from the tip of Zenitsu's fingers, traveling across his skin like a blaze of fire. Every breath Zenitsu took turned into short desperate gasps of air. Zenitsu wanted to clutch at his throat, but his sweaty shaky hands felt much too numb to move. His beating heart felt it could burst from his chest from within, and all that would remain would be nothing. It was over for them, wasn't it? Slap. A sharp spike of pain erupted from Zenitsu's cheek and he blinked, all the fear and panic swiftly leaving him as his blurry sight settled on the eyes of one of the Kikuchi in front of him. The trembling man stared down at him with dark brown eyes, confusion and hesitation ringing in Zenitsu's ears. Panic attack. Zenitsu realized solemnly as the racing in his heart slowly came to a halt. He blinked away the salty tears he could now feel in the corner of his eyes. He had not had those in forever. Not since Tanjiro had found him. The man in front of Zenitsu sighed and ordered Zenitsu to get up, although Zenitsu could sense a barely audible ping of sympathy from his short command. Did he feel sorry for him? At least it was not complete fear and disgust at his appearance, which Zenitsu was grateful for. He was tired of hearing that unforgettable tune. Zenitsu complied with the man, not saying a word, allowing himself to be led away to his next destination. Thankfully, they had taken off the cloth that had been used to blindfold him during his panic attack, so he could now see his surroundings. Although there wasn't much to see given that it was just a wooden hallway he was being led through. They made a right turn and Zenitsu immediately went pale at the many voices he could hear from the large doors up ahead. He could hear the group of voices arguing from within it, disagreeing vehemently at something. So many sounds resounded in his head, making him grimace in pain. The people in the room were strong and they would not hesitate to kill him. They were also painstakingly set on their ideals. After all, it was not hard for Zenitsu to determine what they were disagreeing about. Oh gods, he was going to have to face them all, wasn't he? Heart beating wildly, Zenitsu felt his body tremble, but that didn't matter to the two Kikuchi that was still leading him forward. Finally, at the two large doors, they slid them open, and pulled Zenitsu inside, allowing him to see what awaited him. Only to see the sight of an injured Tanjiro bound in ropes surrounded by 9 scary people. Tanjiro! Zenitsu yelled without thinking. Immediately, the yellow-haired boy dashed forward, his eyes solely trained on Tanjiro's ruby eyes. He ignored the many sounds his sensitive ears quickly picked up around him, screaming at him with thoughts of puzzlement, anger, confusion, and astonishment. No, what mattered at that moment was for him to get to Tanjiro's side. He needed to help his friend. Zenitsu, stop. Zenitsu froze at Tanjiro's voice, lungs heaving as he blinked slowly, his eyes slowly widening in horror at what he saw before him. Tanjiro was in front of him, but outside illuminated by the bright sun from up above. Zenitsu had willingly almost taken a step outside to Tanjiro out of the safety of the dark shaded balcony he was in when he was not completely covered in clothing to protect him from the sun. Zenitsu had almost run blindly to his death. "Good morning, Zenitsu." Zenitsu blinked in confusion at the soft voice that had addressed him and turned to his right, his eyes set on a male figure wearing a black kimono with a long white haori that had a red and purple flame pattern at the bottom. Sitting by the male figure were two girls with short white hair that Zenitsu recognized as seemingly being the same style he remembered seeing on the two strange children from back before at the final selection. Were they related? The man stared at Zenitsu with blank milky eyes, signifying to Zenitsu that the man was blind. But what Zenitsu found himself focusing on more was the purple scar that nearly covered the figure's entire face. It seemed like a burn mark to Zenitsu initially, but the longer he stared at it, the more he realized what the mark was. It was a sickness. It had to be. It was a cruel sickness that had taken the figure's eyesight away, leaving him completely blind to the world around him. There was no way that wasn't incredibly painful. But Zenitsu also felt remorse for the figure. His heartbeat sounded so truthfully sad, making a soft melody that spoke of deep guilt and sadness, and yet there was also an overflowing sense of love from within each beat of the strange tune. Despite never meeting this figure, Zenitsu felt he could melt into his warm embrace and put his complete trust in him. He was a parent that looked at him as if he were his child from his blank, but gentle gaze. "Forgive me, Oyakata-sama," Zenitsu vaguely heard someone say in the distance, and before Zenitsu could register the meaning of the words, he felt his head slamming into the ground. The shock of the impact left Zenitsu with a pounding headache, the echo of the pain overcoming all the sounds around him. He thought he heard Tanjiro yell his name, but it was much too hard to determine. Vision blurry, Zenitsu dared to look up as that was all he could do, only wishing he hadn't. Trembling in horror, his eyes found the heated gaze of a white-haired man with large scars on his face. The tune that rang from the man's heart screeched with each beat of deep hatred for him, making Zenitsu wish he could block out the unforgiving sound. "Sanemi, there is no need for that." The kind man that Zenitsu assumed was Oyakata-sama spoke with a tone of disapproval in his voice. "Please forgive me, Oyakata-sama, but I agree with Samemi's actions here. This demon could go on a rampage and kill you if we're not careful. We cannot allow you to stand by this demon completely unprotected." Zenitsu heard someone say from outside. The voice seemed to belong to someone with an enthusiastic and boastful personality, although clearly, they did not approve of Zenitsu so far. "How can you trust it to stand by you? We can't trust it. We hate demons, to begin with." Another voice added, although this one seemed strict and quite harsh with his comment. This person had no real concern over the fact that Zenitsu was still a member of their association. "I have given my approval for both Tanjiro and Nezuko, and Zenitsu is no exception. I want all of you here to accept them," Oyakata answered. Immediately, Zenitsu heard many voices of outright disapproval, although there seemed to be 3 sounds from the 9 strong figures that seemed okay with him. 2 were only obeying Oyakata's wishes in respect for their leader, but the third one he recognized belonged to the man that had saved him, Tanjiro and Nezuko, back at Nadagumo Mountain. His sound reminded him of a calm flowing body of water lightly touched by the breeze, much too peaceful in its rhythm. Still, it was just frighteningly odd at how calm it sounded at the situation. Why had the man reacted differently to him back at Nadagumo Mountain, and did he know Tanjiro and Nezuko? Before he could ponder over this more, Zenitsu's attention was directed back at the meeting at the sound of parchment paper being opened. "We received this letter from the former pillar, Urokadaki Sakanji-sama. I will read an extract from it." The white-haired child on the right side of Oyakata announced. And Zenitsu could not stop the stream of salty tears that rolled down his cheeks at what he heard. 2 people completely believed in Tanjiro and his sister. They believed in their conviction, their willpower, and their strength to continue on their path together to cure Nezuko. Here, no matter how much Tanjiro tried to explain to the pillars about Nezuko's conditions, these strong demon slayers would deny Tanjiro's plea and kill Nezuko. They were so set on their mission that they could not see that Nezuko was not like any other demon. Yet, Tanjiro had miraculously found two people he could put his complete trust in. And now, they were putting their trust back in him. Zenitsu was beyond happy for the red-haired boy and grateful for the two he had met. He needed this more than anything, to have someone he could trust when no one wanted to listen to him. So, that may be enough for the demon in the box, but that doesn't mean anything for the demon by you, Oyakata-sama. There is no reason for you to approve it. We do not know how many people it has attacked already. The same strict voice remarked. That's not true. Tanjiro yelled, shocking Zenitsu that Tanjiro dared to snap at this group of strong swordsmen. Zenitsu has never harmed anyone. He hid himself from others when he turned into a demon. He is like Nezuko and will never hurt anyone. That doesn't mean anything coming from you. The man holding Zenitsu down shouted from above. Zenitsu disliked the way he talked down to Tanjiro, as if the red-haired boy was lower than the speck of dirt he stood on. That may be so, but I have received news from someone over this matter and they have attested to Tanjiro's word. Oyakata interrupted, momentarily silencing everyone. Zenitsu heard the gentle man raise his hand and a flutter of wings echoed throughout the room, followed by a loud, familiar chirp. Chuntaro. Zenitsu realized. This sparrow belongs to someone I trust. To hear this sparrow again confirms to me that Zenitsu can indeed be trusted like Nezuko. That is why I have also spoken to Zenitsu's MSTR, Oyakata continued, allowing Chuntaro to fly off. And he has decided to place his belief in the child he has trained. If Zenitsu is what Tanjiro claims to be, he will continue to remain a member of this association. However, like Nezuko, if Zenitsu attacks anyone that is not a demon, Tanjiro, and Zenitsu's MSTR will cut open their stomachs in atonement. No. No, no, no. No. Why would Gramps do such a thing? His beloved grandfather deserved so much more than that. To place his belief in him of all people, a successor that could not even stay human. How could he have allowed Gramps to agree on such a decision that would potentially leave him dying in such a painful way? His grandfather should die from old age. Not from that. And how could he do that to Tanjiro, the one who gave him hope? Tanjiro deserved so much better than that. Sure, Zenitsu was trying to do better, but what if he attacked someone? His best friend would have to suffer the consequences of Zenitsu's actions. How could he do that to Tanjiro? That doesn't matter. If these former pillars want to die, they can just die and rot away. There is no guarantee in any of this. The scary man above Zenitsu snarled, teeth gritting with disgust. Shinazugawa is right. If these two demons kill and eat someone, that cannot be undone. The people who get killed can never come back. The enthusiastic man remarked from outside, his voice strikingly loud. That is very true. They can't guarantee that these two demons won't attack people. But, you also can't prove that they'll attack people either, Oyakata replied. The truth is that Nezuko has been living without eating people for more than 2 years, while Zenitsu has done the same for several months now. And because of them, many people are putting their lives on the line, including those that know the severity of what they're denying. Now how can we disrespect our former pillars that have put their lives on the line repeatedly to protect humanity? I understand it's difficult, but trust their judgment as former comrades of this association. They deserve the least of your trust for their past deeds in protecting mankind. There was silence except for the gentle hum of the insects outside stirring. All 9 swordsmen were still and quiet, deep in thought as Oyakata's words resounded in each of their heads. It seemed to Zenitsu that the 9 swordsmen were finally gradually contemplating the situation, or at least taking the time to come to terms with what people were willing to sacrifice to protect himself and Nezuko. Now what only remained was what they would all collectively decide to do. Now of course, we also cannot forget that Tanjiro has come into contact with Kibutsuji himself. And that comment from Oyakata immediately broke the silence, sending all those that were by Tanjiro into a chaotic uproar as they tried to get any viable information they could get from the poor overwhelmed red-haired boy. Tanjiro, ever kind-hearted as he was, tried to answer as much as he could, but it was apparent to Zenitsu that it was too much for him to handle at the moment, especially considering where they were right now. Thankfully, Oyakata came to the rescue and silenced the 9 swordsmen, giving Tanjiro the chance to breathe in relief. Kibutsuji has come after Tanjiro and he shook his pursuer loose, Oyakata continued after everyone had settled down. The reason for this may simply be just to close some loose ends, but for the first time, I don't want to let go of the tale that Kibutsuji has shown us. This probably goes for Nezuko and Zenitsu as well. Something unexpected has happened for Kibutsuji and these two are the result. That is why I am asking you to put your trust in them. Do you understand? Oyakata-sama, the angry guy above Zenitsu growled, the sound of his teeth grinding with each syllable he uttered. We can let humans live, but demons must not. I cannot consent. A sound of a sword was unsheathed and Zenitsu widened his eyes with shock, petrified as the scary man sliced his arm with his sword, blood splattering to the floor by Zenitsu. He stared at the pool of thick crimson blood in a daze, suddenly feeling lightheaded. Nausea crept in from his abdomen as his sight began to waver to blurriness. There was a thick scent tickling the tip of his nose and it continued to grow stronger with each passing second. Saliva began to pool from Zenitsu's mouth as he continued to stare at the thick pool of blood below him. No, stop, please. Iguru, bri, me the ot. 1. There was a barely audible sharp cry from Tanjiro and Zenitsu heard something land right next to him. He thought he heard something cut into the wood, but it was much too hard for Zenitsu to ascertain as if he was listening from underwater. Why couldn't he think straight? No, I don't want this. Oya-sama, I will the ugliness of demons. Zenitsu thought he heard Nezuko's heartbeat pounding with the unbridled fury of a raging tsunami. He thought he could hear Tanjiro yelling in the background as well, but his appealing melody was being drowned out by the sound of blood dripping right next to him. All too quickly, Zenitsu found it harder to concentrate. Everything was becoming muffled and difficult to differentiate. The only thing that he could focus on was the pool of crimson liquid, the scent of iron overtaking every other of his senses, even his hearing. A familiar gnawing pain erupted from his stomach and a strong craving to sink his teeth into the man's arm that the blood trickled down from pounded in his aching head, commanding him to get up and move. Please, I can't do that. Zenitsu felt his body rise, mouth watering and his fangs uncovered for all to see. He was so close to the blood. Just a little more and the gnawing hunger would cease to exist. It would only take one bite and it would be over. Yes, that was what the sweet delicate blood in front of him promised. He just needed to consume it with all the greed in the world. Zenitsu. Zenitsu froze. Lungs heaving, Zenitsu turned to the voice that had called out to him, his eyes settling on the kind-hearted person that made a promise to save him. The ruby-eyed boy that hid his sorrow and pain behind his conviction to go to great lengths just to save those that were dear to him. The strong swordsman that constantly reminded him to be a better person and not become another monster. That boy was no other than his dear friend. Tanjiro. Zenitsu blinked and looked around in a daze, struck by all the watchful eyes on him. All the Hashira were staring at him, some with curiosity while others with disgust and animosity. He chose to ignore their predatory gazes and turn to the familiar female demon by his side. He was surprised to see Nezuko next to him, her hand gripped tightly into his hand as her chest heaved with each breath she took. Her head was turned away from the scary man in front of them, drool trickling down from her covered mouth to the floor. It was obvious to Zenitsu that Nezuko was struggling to keep her composure and remain still. And yet, somehow Nezuko found the strength to grab onto his hand. Seeing the kind young girl in such a state, Zenitsu realized he had enough. He was done. Stop it. Zenitsu yelled, immediately shocking every person in the vicinity with the sound of his voice. I don't care what you think of me, but Nezuko-chan isn't a monster. She would never hurt anyone. She's a victim, a kind girl that lost everything with her brother. And despite that, all she has ever done is protect people with Tanjiro. Stop treating her like this. Stop hurting her. She's gone through enough already. You're too cruel to ignore what's right in front of you. Grow up. Zenitsu paused, lungs heaving as he took the time to process what he said, his face becoming ashen pale in a matter of seconds. He had yelled at the 9 pillars, the strongest swordsman in the Demon Slayer Association. He was as good as dead, wasn't he? Oh, what would Gramps think of him now? He was an embarrassment to his MSTR. No, forget that, he was an embarrassment as a demon slayer. Ha! The ruthless man in front of Zenitsu scoffed with a scowl. The F, you said? A victim? Are you that stupid? Demons are not victims. They kill and eat humans. They're not worth saving or protecting. The man narrowed his eyes, his crazed eyes glinting with deep-rooted hatred and fury. But what do you know, demon? If you were a true demon slayer, you would have chopped off your shitty head the moment you became one. Zenitsu swallowed, lost for words. He felt his hands dig into the fabric of his uniform as the familiar urge to burst into tears set in. Months ago, Zenitsu would have agreed without any question. He should have cut off his head the moment he had turned into a demon. It was what he was expected to do, but meeting Tanjiro had changed that perception. Tanjiro, Nezuko, and Inosuke had changed everything that Zenitsu thought he knew. That was why Zenitsu knew the scary man was wrong. Still, it was clear from what he had said that anything Zenitsu argued back would not change their minds about himself and Nezuko. It didn't matter how much they explained or even showed how different they were from other demons, the pillars would still see them as man-eating monsters. At the end of the day, that was what all he and Nezuko were to them. It was beyond frustrating. While Zenitsu didn't think he was as strong as Nezuko, he was improving. They both were. They were both continuously denying what they had become. How could these swordsmen not see their effort? But then again, Zenitsu questioned if their approval was even worth it. Did it matter what they saw when Oyakata himself already placed his trust in both Nezuko and Zenitsu? When both Inosuke and Tanjiro already trusted the pair of demons? No, Zenitsu supposed it didn't matter. Not at all. I did want to chop my head off, Zenitsu decided to say, blinking away the tears, refusing to cry in front of the Hashira. I wanted to kill myself so badly. Not a day went by without me wanting to end it all in that stupid house because it would have been so much easier than ignoring the painful hunger I felt back then. But you know what I realized? Killing myself would have been the easy way out. It would just be me running away from the problem. That's not what my MSTR taught me. Nezuko-chan and I have gone through so much just so that we could stand here today to show you that we're not monsters. We're more than that. Zenitsu gritted his teeth and with all the courage he had left in his trembling form, defiantly glared right back at the terrifying pillars in front of him. And the both of us are going to continue to fight this way whether you approve of it or not. There was only silence to answer Zenitsu, not that he didn't mind. It was better than having to further listen to the pillars' disapproval. Zenitsu hoped his answer was enough, at least to protect Nezuko. Zenitsu is right, Oyakata's gentle voice rang out from beside Zenitsu, he and Nezuko have proven themselves already. There is nothing more to debate over this issue, especially after hearing Zenitsu's answer. Sanemi, you must not bully the younger ones. Both Zenitsu and Nezuko have shown that they will not attack humans. Zenitsu widened his eyes and turned to Oyakata, immediately filled with a sense of comfort from the man's blank eyes. He didn't even seem angry at him. No, far from that, he agreed with him during his outburst. How could someone be so kind and even more human than all those that surrounded them? Now Tanjiro, there will still be those who won't willingly agree about Nezuko and Zenitsu. You just have to prove that you three can be strong enough to fight with the demon hunters. I understand you defeated one of the 12 demon moons, the lower rank 5 demons. I commend you for that, but unfortunately, that has proven not to be enough. Defeat higher ranked demon moons. If you do that, everyone will acknowledge your conviction, and the gravity of your words will change. And Zenitsu, while I do understand your frustration, please try to respect the demon hunter pillars. They have talents that naturally surpass you and Tanjiro. You must remember to respect them and treat them well. Continue to prove to them that you are indeed a demon slayer. Zenitsu felt his cheeks go pink in embarrassment, but nodded quietly, respectively bowing to the kind man. He wouldn't forgive the pillars around him yet, but he would at least make the effort to acknowledge how strong they were. They were quite scary people after all. Now we will be ending the conversation over Tanjiro, Nezuko, and Zenitsu here. It's about time to begin the pillar meeting, Oyakata concluded with a warm smile. The butterfly lady raised her hand and offered to take care of Tanjiro and his demon companions at her estate, but Oyakata advised her to leave Zenitsu behind. Instantly, Zenitsu felt Nezuko wrap her arms around his waist with a huff while Tanjiro politely denied Oyakata's words. Zenitsu had to blink away the fresh tears he could feel from his eyes. The two cared so much for him and he was grateful for that. Truthfully, Zenitsu did not want to be separated from them as well. Not after everything they had gone through together, but he knew it was not wise to disrespect Oyakata's wishes. Zenitsu will be safe, Tanjiro, Oyakata said with a serene smile, easily consoling the red-haired boy. Someone important to Zenitsu has requested to speak with him. Until then, allow yourself to rest. Zenitsu will join you and your sister shortly. Someone important? Zenitsu gaped in confusion, lost for words. Who would want to speak to him? Certainly, no one that Zenitsu could think of. However, it seemed from Oyakata's tone that this person was someone that Zenitsu knew quite well and wasn't afraid of his demon characteristics. The only person he could think about was his grandfather, but he couldn't be here of course. His estate was much too far away for him to make the journey. It had to be someone else. But who could it be? And then Zenitsu heard it, the sound of thunder roaring. It was a sound of a heartbeat that he had come to terms with that he would never hear again, a sound he had missed dearly as it always held nothing but unconditional concern and pride for him. How the person whom the sound belonged to had found Zenitsu he had no idea, but he didn't care. Not now after everything he had been forced to overcome. Eyes glistening from so many emotions, he listened as the Kikushi finally led a familiar old man into the room with a deafening sound. Throat painfully dry, Zenitsu somehow still managed to find his voice. Ji-chan.